Let's begin in a place that oversaw nearly every intimate act in the medieval world, the church. Whether you were a peasant or a prince, how you thought about sex was shaped not just by desire, but by doctrine. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just a private act, it was something watched over, scrutinized by heaven. The church didn't just want to bless marriages, it wanted to control what happened in the bedroom. And to do that, it had to answer a question that seems absurdly basic, but was incredibly complicated in the medieval mind. Is sex sinful, even in marriage? The answer was, sometimes. Maybe. Depends on your intention. Let's break that down. The original sin argument. In the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve disobey God and eat the fruit. Many medieval theologians, especially Saint Augustine, saw that moment not just as disobedience, but as the moment lust itself was born. Before the fall, sex was imagined to be calm, rational, even sacred. After the fall, it became messy, overwhelming, uncontrollable. Lust was now a wildfire inside the soul, capable of dragging people straight to hell. So even within marriage, even when it was for children, sex was seen as tainted, a concession to human weakness. The best sex in the church's eyes wasn't the most passionate. It was the most controlled. Sex within marriage, a tolerated necessity. By the 12th century, church teaching allowed sex in marriage, cautiously. If a married couple had sex out of lust, even with each other, that could still be sinful. But if they did it with the intent to conceive, they were in the clear. Medieval confession manuals spelled this out in extraordinary detail. These were little guides for priests, listing sins and the expected penance. Here sets a real example. Did you sleep with your wife with the intention of avoiding children? Did you take pleasure in the act, even if it was with your spouse? Did you use unnatural positions? Yes, even sexual positions were regulated. The church favored the so-called missionary position, husband on top, face to face, because it mirrored the natural order, and they argued the proper hierarchy of man over woman. Anything else was suspect. Penances and confession booths. Let's say you were a peasant named Tomas. You're married. You sleep with your wife out of affection, not strictly to make a child. The next week, you head to confession. The priest might ask, in hushed tones, did you think impure thoughts before the act? Did you spill seed unnecessarily? And if Thomas admitted to getting a little carried away, his penance might be 3 days of fasting or a week of prayer, depending on the severity. It wasn't just about the act, it was about what was in your heart. Lust, even between spouses, was spiritually dangerous. Sex on the calendar. The church also laid out a strict calendar of forbidden days for sex. These included every Sunday, it was the Lord Seps Day, all Lent 40 days, Advent, 3 days before receiving communion, days before Saint Sift feast days, Friday's Christop's crucifixion. In total, more than 100 days per year were considered inappropriate for sex. Some bishops suggested avoiding sex on Wednesdays and Saturdays too, just in case. This was less about the body and more about discipline. Sex was a moment where self-control could be lost. Better to skip it than risk damnation. Celibacy as the ideal. If sex was allowed but suspect, then the ideal Christian life was celibate. This is why monks and nuns, those who vowed never to marry, were seen as spiritually superior. Virginity wasn't just a condition, it was a spiritual weapon. Many medieval saints were celebrated for remaining virgins. Women like Saint Cecilia and Saint Agnes were said to have rejected marriage, endured torture, even death, to preserve their chastity. Some stories verge on the fantastical. There's a tale of a virgin saint who, when threatened with rape, miraculously grew a beard to scare off her attacker. Yes, a miracle beard. These weren't just tales of purity, they were dramatic endorsements of celibacy as the path to holiness. Sex outside marriage, a hierarchy of sin. What about everyone else? Medieval theologians built a mental chart, an informal ladder of sexual sins. Here states how it might look, from bad to worse. Married sex without intent to procreate, premarital sex, fornication, adultery, masturbation, often called self-pollution, homosexual acts, bestiality, and other unnatural acts. Each had its own punishment, spiritual and sometimes legal. But again, intent mattered. Did you give in to temptation, or was it premeditated? Did you confess quickly, or hide it? The soul was weighed on a fine scale. Theology meets biology, the medieval sperm theory. Here steps a twist. Despite the church's obsession with regulating sex, medieval thinkers had wildly incorrect ideas about how sex worked biologically. One popular theory, drawn from Aristotle and Galen, held that both men and women produced seed, and that for conception to occur, both had to orgasm. No female orgasm, no baby. This belief had strange consequences. In rape cases, some courts ruled that if a woman got pregnant, it must not have been rape because her seed had to be released too. A tragic, terrible misunderstanding. But it also meant that sex wasn't purely male-dominated. In theory, a woman's pleasure mattered, even if in practice, few listened. The devil in the bedroom. The church also warned of demons that could enter the bedroom. Literally, male demons, known as incubi, were said to attack women in their sleep, lying on them and causing sexual dreams. Or worse, female demons called succubi tempted men in the night, drawing out their life force through sex. These weren't just metaphors. Some people believed succubi caused wet dreams, or incubi caused sudden pregnancies. Sexual dreams, already suspect, were now demonic. Priests advised praying before bed, sleeping with relics, or even moving to another room if the attacks continued. Mortal or venial, depends on the mood. The church divided sins into two categories. Venial, minor sins that weakened the soul, but didn't damn it. Mortal, serious sins that if unconfessed could condemn you to hell. Sex, depending on context, could be either. That's what made it so tricky. You weren't safe just because you were married. You weren't damned just because you made a mistake. Everything came down to intention, confession, and control. The quiet double standard. Finally, it's worth noting, the church preached strict sexual morals, but in practice, things were more flexible, especially for the powerful. Nobles had mistresses. Priests kept concubines, despite vows of celibacy. Popes had illegitimate children. The rules were preached loudly, but not always followed. Peasants likely understood this. They bent the rules, confessed when they had to, and lived as best they could between sin and survival. So what was sex really like in the eyes of the medieval church? Complicated. Sacred, but shameful. Allowed but tightly fenced in. It was always being watched, not just by partners, but by God, saints, priests, and even demons. The soul was never alone in the bedroom. And yet, for all the rules, people kept loving, touching, fumbling, sinning, repenting, and trying again. Because even in the strictest times, desire didn't vanish. It just whispered more softly. So far, we've heard what the church said about sex. Now let's get closer to the mattress. Forget the theology books for a moment. Imagine instead a small cottage in a rainy English village, or a timber-framed room above a narrow Florentine street. A couple lies together in a shared bed. What did sex actually look like for them, day to day, year after year? Let's start with the bed itself. The bed wasn't set private. We tend to imagine the bed as a private sanctuary. For most medieval people, it wasn't. Beds were expensive, even prized family heirlooms. In poorer homes, a single bed might be shared between parents and children, or even between multiple siblings. Servants sometimes slept at the foot of the bed. Travelers might be invited to share it. And while most married couples tried to find time alone, true privacy was rare. Curtains helped, but thin walls didn't. Sex had to happen anyway, so it happened quietly, strategically, and often without much preamble. The modern idea of a private romantic space? That's modern. Most couples then had to make do in the gaps between responsibilities. The bedding ceremony. Public start, private act. When a marriage began, it usually started with a public ritual called the bedding ceremony. This was part celebration, part surveillance. After the wedding feast, the couple would be walked, sometimes drunkenly, sometimes nervously, to the marriage bed by friends or family. Jokes were made, shoes were thrown. Occasionally, someone tried to sneak a peek. In some regions, witnesses stayed in the room to ensure the marriage was consummated. Others waited outside and inspected the sheets afterward for signs of blood, proving the bride's virginity. The point wasn't just celebration. It was legal and social verification. Sex made the marriage binding. Without consummation, it could be annulled. Consent, a real legal requirement, at least in theory. One of the more progressive facts about medieval marriage is this mutual consent mattered. According to canon law, a marriage couldn't be valid unless both parties freely agreed to it. A forced marriage could be challenged, and in some cases, annulled. This didn't mean all marriages were fair. Power dynamics still ruled, especially among the wealthy. Parents arranged unions. Women, especially young ones, had little leverage. But at least in legal theory, consent had to be present. There are surviving records of women testifying that they had been forced or deceived into marriage, and courts sometimes sided with them. It wasn't common, but it was possible. How often did couples have sex? This varied wildly. Some medieval texts suggested once a week as a pious balance between marital duty and spiritual discipline. Others warned against excessive lust, even within marriage. One 12th century text advised newlyweds to wait 3 days after the wedding before sleeping together so their desire wouldn't overwhelm their reason. But human nature being what it is, most people likely followed their own rhythms. And sex wasn't just about pleasure or intimacy, it was tied to a religious expectation. Procreation. Children weren't just welcome, they were expected. A barren marriage was a source of anxiety, suspicion, and even shame. Positions and postures. What was allowed? Clerical guides had opinions about what married couples could and couldn't do in bed. Missionary. Face to face, man on top, was the preferred method. Anything else, side by side, woman on top, from behind, was often considered unnatural and potentially sinful. Oral sex and anal sex were strictly forbidden, even within marriage. There was debate over whether sex during pregnancy was allowed. Some thinkers said yes, since the womb was already occupied. Others said no, to preserve the purity of the unborn child. What's clear is that rules existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. What couples actually did in private often didn't match what the manuals said. Love and affection did exist. Despite the church's often grim view of sex, love and affection were real parts of marriage for many people. Letters between spouses, especially among the literate classes, show tenderness. Couples called each other my joy, my heart, and my soul's rest. Some even wrote erotic poetry, though it was usually coded. A 14th century Englishwoman named Marjorie Paston once wrote to her husband John, "My own sweetheart, I long for your coming home." Not exactly erotic, but it shows longing, connection, something real. Even among peasants who left behind fewer letters, the desire for companionship shows up in wills, witness testimonies, and folk songs. Marriage wasn't just about survival. It could hold love, humor, and affection, and sex was often part of that. What about pain, fear, or pressure? Not all medieval sex was consensual or joyful. Marital rape wasn't legally recognized as a crime. A wife's body was seen as belonging to her husband once vows were exchanged. This didn't mean every man abused that power, but the protection simply wasn't there. Some women did refuse sex. They used illness as an excuse or invoked saints and holy days. Some took long pilgrimages, which doubled as time away from the marital bed. There are rare cases of women seeking legal or ecclesiastical help to separate from abusive or sexually coercive husbands. Again, rare, but not impossible. The church advised that a man should not approach his wife as a brute beast, but what that meant in practice depended entirely on the individual. Sex after childbirth. Rules and realities. After giving birth, women were often considered ritually unclean for 30 to 40 days. During this time, sex was forbidden. The church required a ritual called churching, where the mother was blessed and symbolically welcomed back into society in the bedroom. Medically, this rest period was probably a relief. Childbirth was exhausting and dangerous. Waiting made sense. But pressure to produce another child came quickly. Infant mortality was high. The average woman might bear 6 to 10 children during her life. Many didn't survive half that number. So, sex after childbirth wasn't about pleasure, it was often about trying again. Contraception, quiet, risky, and real. Here's seeds where things get more complicated. The church forbade contraception, but that didn't stop people from trying. Women passed down herbal knowledge through generations. What to drink, when to avoid sex, what symptoms to watch for. Certain herbs like pennyroyal or rue were used to prevent or end pregnancies. These remedies were part folk wisdom, part desperate attempt to control fate. If a woman was suspected of using contraceptives, or if a man was caught using a coitus interruptus method, confessors could assign severe penance. But the knowledge persisted, quietly, stubbornly, whispered between midwives, aunts, and neighbors, infertility and blame. If a couple failed to conceive, the blame almost always landed on the woman. She might be accused of coldness. Literally, some medical texts said a woman's womb needed to be warm and moist to receive seed. If she was too dry or frigid, nothing would grow. Infertile women were pitied, sometimes mocked, occasionally feared. If a man failed to father children, his masculinity was questioned, but he could still remarry. The barren woman had fewer options. Fertility rituals sprang up around this anxiety, pilgrimages to saintly shrines, wearing relics near the womb, drinking special waters, praying to Saint Anne or Saint Margaret. Some women even lay on saints' tombs, hoping for a miracle. Desire didn't vanish with age. Older couples didn't just stop having sex. That's a myth. While fertility declined, affection didn't always. There are records of elderly couples fighting, laughing, reconciling, and sharing a bed. One 13th century poem speaks of an old farmer gently teasing his wife about her snoring, then wrapping an arm around her as they drift off. Not explicit, but intimate. The fire dimmed, but didn't go out. Not entirely. Conclusion: the messy, quiet truth. For all the church's rules, marriage was still a human space, filled with awkwardness, laughter, tension, need, boredom, comfort, and sometimes joy. Sex in marriage wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romanticized. It was ordinary, sometimes burdensome, sometimes tender, often private, and hard to pin down. But it was part of the rhythm of life, a thread running through hard work, cold winters, hungry children, whispered prayers, and candlelit nights. And that ordinariness, the fact that it wasn't exceptional, is what makes it matter. Because even in an age of rules and rituals, people still found ways to be close, to reach for each other, to make room for something soft in a hard world. For all the sermons and rules, there was one simple truth about medieval sex that rarely made it into the pulpit. The people preaching chastity didn't always practice it. Clergy weren't immune to temptation. Monks, nuns, bishops, even popes, they were all human, and despite the vows, the robes, and the rules, many had secret lives shaped by desire, loneliness, rebellion, or quiet longing. Let's open that door. The rule of celibacy and how it got there. In the early centuries of Christianity, many priests were married. It wasn't until the 11th century, during a reform movement, that the church officially banned priests from marrying or having sex. This wasn't just about holiness, it was political. Married priests often passed church land to their children. The church wanted to keep property under its control, and celibacy made that easier. So a new rule took hold. Priests must be celibate, no marriage, no sex, no heirs. But enforcing that was another story. Priests and their housekeepers. In practice, many parish priests continued quietly living with women, sometimes called concubines, sometimes servants, sometimes just my cousin who helps around the house. Everyone knew what was going on. Villagers whispered. Bishops sent letters of reprimand, but the relationships often continued. In some areas, bishops charged a fee to look the other way. The priest paid, kept his woman, and life went on. These weren't always lust-fueled flings. Some were stable, affectionate partnerships. There are cases of priests raising children, even naming them openly, but the church considered these relationships sinful and periodically tried to crack down. It rarely worked. Monasteries? Walls Dawn said stop desire. Inside monasteries, temptation didn't vanish. It just got quieter. Monks lived under strict rules. No sex, no marriage, long hours of prayer. But they were still human beings, many entering young, some never having chosen the life freely. Sexual dreams were common, so were wet dreams, called nocturnal emissions. Some monks considered them demonic attacks. Others saw them as a sign of hidden sin. Manuals advised sleeping on hard beds, avoiding spicy food, and confessing immediately after any sexual dream, even if uninvited. Some monks fasted or flogged themselves to suppress desire. Still, relationships formed among brothers, sometimes romantic, sometimes physical. These were rarely acknowledged openly, but they existed. Letters between monks, the lonely soul. Occasionally, we catch a glimpse of intimacy in the margins. Literally, monks copied manuscripts by hand, and some left personal notes tucked into the pages. One monk in 12th century France wrote a poem to a fellow brother, praising his beauty and voice. It reads like love. Chaste, maybe. Maybe not. These fragments show a deep hunger for connection. In communities where touch was limited and solitude enforced, even a gentle word or a shared glance could carry enormous emotional weight, and sometimes they carried more. Nunneries, desire behind the veil. Nuns took the same vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. They were expected to live like brides of Christ, pure, self-contained, untouched by the world. Many lived devout, disciplined lives. Others didn't. Some nuns wrote erotic poetry. Some snuck out to meet lovers. Others invited men into the cloister. Scandals occurred, though many were buried under layers of shame and silence. One 14th century nun in Italy was found pregnant. She claimed the Holy Spirit had visited her. The local bishop disagreed. In another case, a group of nuns were discovered running an informal brothel out of their convent. The church shut it down. Quietly, confession booth confessions. Priests heard confessions. But sometimes they crossed the line. There are documented cases of priests seducing women who came to confess. The intimacy, secrecy, and vulnerability of confession created opportunity. Some men abused it. Theologians condemned this fiercely. One bishop wrote that a priest who sleeps with a penitent woman destroys both body and soul. Still, it happened, and the women involved were often blamed more than the priests. Punishment sometimes. When clergy broke celibacy, punishment varied. A monk caught in sexual sin might be flogged, made to fast, or reassigned to another monastery. A nun who became pregnant could be expelled or forced into strict penance. A priest with a known concubine might be fined or suspended, but powerful clergy often escaped consequences. There were bishops with mistresses, cardinals with illegitimate children, and even popes who fathered multiple offspring. Pope Alexander VI Rodrigo Borgia had at least 4 children, all publicly acknowledged. One became a military commander. Another, Lucrezia, became infamous in her own right. The church scolded, but it didn't set always remove. Queer desire in the cloister, monasteries, and convents were same-sex spaces, often for life. Desire didn't disappear in those walls. Some relationships between monks or between nuns or deeply emotional, called particular friendships. These could be platonic, but sometimes they crossed into romance. Records are scarce, partly because the church suppressed them, but occasional letters, trial records, or confessions hint at real passion. In 13th century Paris, two nuns were accused of unnatural acts and separated. They had lived together for years. Their letters were destroyed. The church viewed same-sex acts as mortal sins, but the reality in cloisters was far more complicated, especially where loneliness met tenderness, dreams, demons, and dread. Remember the succubi and incubi, the sex demons from Section 1? Clergy were especially targeted in these stories. A monk who had an erotic dream might believe he was being attacked by a succubus. A nun who experienced nocturnal arousal might be said to be under demonic influence. Some embraced this as a coping mechanism. After all, if a demon caused the dream, maybe it wasn't your fault. Others saw it as punishment for secret sin. The body, after all, didn't lie. If it responded, even in sleep, maybe the soul was guilty. This fear ran deep. Some monks even slept upright, with arms crossed, to avoid tempting their own bodies. Spiritual eroticism, the blurry line. Not all desire was condemned. Some saints experienced a kind of spiritual eroticism, a rapture that blurred the line between divine love and physical pleasure. Take Saint Teresa of Avila. In her writings, she describes an angel piercing her heart with a burning spear. The pain was exquisite, the joy overwhelming. Many have read it as a mystical orgasm. Men had these experiences too, visions of Christ embracing them, filling them with light, making them tremble with joy. The church accepted these as holy, but to a modern reader, the language is deeply sensual. In suppressing bodily sex, some mystics redirected their passion toward the divine and found ecstasy there. The quiet survival of love. Despite rules, repression, and risk, love found a way. Some monks fell in love and left the cloister. Some priests begged to marry the women they loved. Some nuns gave birth in secret and raised children quietly. Others held their longings silently, pouring it into poetry, prayer, or aching solitude. It wasn't always sin. Sometimes it was simply longing with nowhere to go. Conclusion: a church of flesh and spirit. The medieval church set itself up as a beacon of purity, but beneath the surface, its leaders lived with the same contradictions as everyone else. They preached chastity and craved affection. They demanded celibacy and sometimes defied it. They warned against lust, but weren't free from it. In the end, the church's war with sex wasn't just a set of rules. It was a tug of war between body and spirit, played out behind monastery walls, in candlelit confessionals, and in the silence of locked cells. And for every scandal that made the records, dozens more likely never did, lost to whispered apologies, torn up letters, or quiet graves. Because even in the most sacred spaces, the human heart still beat, and sometimes it beat faster than the rules allowed. Forget castles and cathedrals for a moment. Most people in medieval Europe lived in small villages or towns, working the land, grinding flour, weaving cloth. They lived close to the soil, close to each other, and close to nature's rhythms. And even here, in the mud and barley and hay, people fell in love, or something like it. Let's talk about how people found each other in the medieval countryside. Nuns, not the idealized version painted by poets, but the actual rituals of courtship, flirtation, and attraction among people who shared fields, beds, and gossip. Where it all started, the village itself. In a typical medieval village, everyone knew everyone. Children grew up together. Families lived in tight clusters. Privacy was rare. That closeness created opportunity and pressure. People married within a few miles of where they were born. You might see your future spouse daily, at the well, in the fields, at the village green. That closeness made flirtation cautious, but ever present. There were no dating apps, but there was the maypole, festivals, where flirting got permission. Seasonal festivals, especially May Day, Midsummer, and Harvest, were crucial social windows. Work slowed, ale flowed, music played, and the rules relaxed just enough to let people flirt. Young men and women danced together, often in symbolic games. Circling the maypoles wasn't just fun, it was full of fertility symbolism. Ribbons, poles, circles. It didn't take a priest to see what was going on. At night, couples might slip away. Some communities even had traditions of greenwood marriages, temporary unions formed in the forest during May Day. These weren't officially recognized, but they were tolerated, sometimes even expected. Many children were born 9 months after May. Gift-giving and token love. Medieval courtship often involved small, meaningful gifts. A man might carve a comb or spoon for a woman. A woman might embroider a token, maybe a ribbon or a piece of cloth with his initials. Flowers were common. Herbs too, especially ones linked to love, like rosemary or lavender. These weren't extravagant. They were simple, personal, and full of layered meaning. A young woman might sleep with a gift under her pillow. A man might carry a scrap of ribbon inside his shirt. It wasn't about cost, it was about connection. Love songs and whispered promises. People didn't write long love letters. Not in the village. Most were illiterate, but oral culture was rich. Folk songs were a major form of flirtation and fantasy. Some were romantic, others were bluntly sexual. Men sang about lust, women answered back in verse. One popular song from 14th century England opens with, "I sowed my seed in a good broad land, and waited for rain from her soft white hand." You don't need a translation to guess what that's about. In quiet corners, lovers whispered promises. Some were honest, others less so. A man might say he intended marriage just to get a girl into bed, or he might mean it until the baby came. The language of touch. Touch was limited in public, but not forbidden. Holding hands at a feast, brushing arms during a dance, walking together on a church path. These little moments mattered. Everyone noticed. Kisses were powerful. A kiss could mean a lot, or be written off as harmless. In some customs, a public kiss meant a betrothal. In others, it was just part of the fun. If a man kissed a woman in church or during a sacred festival, it could lead to a formal obligation. Witnesses might testify. Families might pressure a marriage. A kiss could be legally binding. Betrothal, half married, half free. Betrothal in the Middle Ages wasn't just a vague promise, it was a legally recognized agreement, what canon lawyers called sponsalia. There were two kinds, sponsalia per verba di presenti, and take you now as my spouse. This could count as an actual marriage, if witnessed. Sponsalia per verba de futura, I will take you as my spouse. This was more like an engagement. Couples who spoke these words to each other in front of witnesses might already be considered married in the church's eyes, especially if sex followed. This led to complicated legal cases where couples claimed or denied that they'd ever exchanged vows. Witnesses were called, gifts were examined, even gossip came into play. Courtship by proxy, friends and go-betweens. Sometimes, love wasn't a private thing. You needed help. In many villages, parents, friends, or matchmakers got involved. A man might send a friend to sound out a girl's interest. A girl might send her cousin to ask about a boy's intentions. Some of this was strategic. A good match meant stability. Families didn't want their daughters married to drunkards or debtors, but young people still had a say. And when they didn't set, they sometimes ran off. Elopement. Love versus custom. Not every couple wanted to wait for parental approval. Elopement was a real option, especially if two people feared separation or if a woman was pregnant. Couples could say the marriage vows to each other anywhere, under a tree, in a field, and the church might later recognize it as binding. There are records of couples marrying at night, alone, then seeking witnesses the next day. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it caused chaos. Elopements could trigger family feuds, village gossip, or even local trials. But for couples in love, or just in lust, it was worth the risk. Class and love, boundaries and breaches. Most village love happened within class lines, but not always. There are scattered records of knights seducing village girls, or lords arranging dalliances with servant women. These relationships weren't courtship, they were power plays. Consent in these cases was murky. A woman might say yes to avoid consequences, or she might say no and be ignored. But sometimes, village men fell for noble women. These stories were rare and often tragic. The gap between classes made real union nearly impossible. Still, the stories exist. Songs, poems, and legends often tell of a bold farmhand who loved a noble lady. The endings vary. Love magic, trying to tip the scales. Love wasn't left entirely to chance. People used folk magic to attract or bind a partner. Sprinkle rose water where the person walked. Hide a hair under their pillow. Burn a lock of your hair while whispering their name. Drink a tea made with certain herbs and think of them before bed. Some spells were more intense, written charms tucked into clothing, or candles carved with initials and burned in secret. These were risky. The church condemned love magic as heresy or witchcraft, but that didn't stop people from trying, especially if they were desperate. So what did courtship really look like in the medieval village? It was playful, strategic, sometimes sweet, sometimes selfish. It happened at dances and at wells, behind hay bales and beside church walls. It lived in glances, in songs, in the flicker of a shared look at dusk. Love wasn't sanitized. It wasn't poetic. It was muddy and real. And even when the church frowned and the neighbors gossiped, people still flirted, still carved initials into trees, still stole kisses at midnight, still dreamed of someone warm beside them in the cold months. Because even in a world ruled by rules, spring still came, and with it, desire. You could sing all the songs you wanted, trade all the gifts, make all the vague promises, but once clothes came off, things got real. Because sex before marriage wasn't rare in medieval villages. It was common, expected even, but it came with consequences. some social, some legal, some lasting for generations. Let's break down what actually happened when people had sex outside marriage and what the village did about it. Bedding before wedding was a thing. Let's be clear, premarital sex was technically forbidden by the church, but on the ground, it was everywhere. There's a term historians use, trial marriage. It wasn't an official status, but a practical one. Couples often considered themselves engaged, exchanged vows informally, then started sleeping together. In many rural areas, having sex during betrothal wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Why? Because people wanted proof the couple was fertile. Marriage meant land, inheritance, and babies. No babies, no future. So a man and woman might sleep together before formal vows. If she got pregnant, they married quickly. If not, they might still marry, or not. The baby bump sealed the deal. It wasn't set, exactly romantic, but it was real. She seps swollen. They must be promised. A phrase you see in medieval court records. They were known to lie together. That meant everyone knew they were having sex. Maybe they were seen leaving a barn together. Maybe her belly was growing. Maybe she confessed. Maybe he bragged. And often, if pregnancy followed, the assumption was that some kind of promise had been made. In law, this was important, because if there was sex plus a promise to marry, that could legally count as a marriage. So if a man slept with a woman and she said he promised marriage, courts sometimes upheld that even if he later denied it. One famous 14th century English case involved a woman named Marjorie who became pregnant after her betrothed slept with her. He tried to marry someone else. She took him to court. The judge sided with Marjorie. His promise plus sex == valid marriage. Pregnancy was evidence. Sometimes all the evidence needed. Bastards. What if the wedding never happened? Sometimes, though, there was no promise, no follow-through, just sex, pregnancy, and shame. And that seps when the baby was labeled a bastard. This word wasn't just a slur, it had real legal weight. A child born out of wedlock had limited rights. They couldn't inherit land. They were excluded from guilds or clerical life. Their path in life narrowed from birth. For the mother, it was worse. She might be punished by the church, fined, whipped, or made to do public penance. In some cases, she had to stand barefoot before the congregation and confess her sin aloud. Fathers didn't always face punishment, unless the woman could prove a promise or unless the village forced him to pay child support. Because yes, medieval villages had their own version of child support. Leaky roof, full belly, the logic of support. If a man got a woman pregnant and didn't marry her, the village might demand he provide for her and the child. This wasn't always out of fairness. It was about economics. A single mother meant someone had to help her, usually her family or the local poor fund. Villagers didn't want to carry the cost, so they pressured the man. In some areas, local courts issued what were called bastardy bonds. These were agreements that said, you got her pregnant. You start paying for this childless care. If you skip town, we'll come after you. Of course, not every woman could prove paternity. Men denied, families lied, and some women were left to raise a child alone, poor and shamed. Quickie weddings and retroactive respectability. To avoid scandal, families often rushed weddings once pregnancy was clear. This is where the phrase married in the church porch sometimes comes in. These were emergency weddings, done fast, often at the church door, in front of witnesses, but without much ceremony. It was a way to legitimize the child and avoid the disgrace of bastardy. In some cases, a baby born just a few weeks after a wedding was still considered legitimate. As long as the couple married before the birth, the church turned a blind eye. Legitimacy wasn't about math, it was about timing. What if he denied it? Enter the bed testers. Here's stats where things get stranger. In some communities, when a woman accused a man of sleeping with her and he denied it, she could demand a kind of trial. And sometimes this meant testing the bed. This wasn't a forensic investigation. There were no DNA tests, but villagers might inspect the bed where she said the sex happened. They'd look for signs, stains, disrupted straw, impressions. Sometimes women produce stained underclothes as evidence to witnesses who saw them enter or leave the house. Some communities even used wise women or midwives to inspect the woman physically. It was all crude, often humiliating, but it was an attempt to get at the truth in a world without scientific proof. Did it work? Not always. But it gave women some leverage. The double standard, virginity and reputation. Let's talk about virginity. For women, it was prized, expected, protected in theory. A woman who remained a virgin until marriage had more marriage options and social respect. For men, virginity was barely discussed. Boys were expected to sow wild oats, especially among the lower classes. A man's sexual past rarely haunted him, but for women, one mistake could be a life sentence. And yet, despite the shame, despite the risk, many took that risk anyway, because desire didn't care about sermons, because love made people reckless, because sometimes life just happened. Wet nurses, abandonment, and tough choices. Unwanted pregnancies led to difficult outcomes. Some wealthier families employed wet nurses, often poor village women who nursed the child so the mother could resume life as normal. Other children were abandoned. This happened more in cities than villages, but it wasn't unknown. Some babies were left on church steps or near convents. Others died in secret. Infanticide did happen. Women desperate to hide their shame sometimes killed newborns. These were capital crimes if discovered. Courts handed down death sentences. The church excommunicated them. But just as often, women carried the child, raised it, and bore the shame. Folklore and the supernatural. Sex outside marriage didn't just bring scandal, it brought superstition. Many villages believed that children conceived in sin were more vulnerable to sickness, bad luck, or evil spirits. Some said bastards couldn't be baptized properly, that the devil had some hold on them. Others feared that sex outside wedlock invited demonic possession. Stories tell of women who were haunted or punished after seducing men, or of men who dreamed of fire and were struck with impotence. In some regions, people sprinkled holy water on beds or babies born of illicit unions, not to shame, but to protect. The supernatural was never far from sex, and yet it was everywhere. Despite all the rules, punishments, and shame, people kept doing it. Sex before marriage was common, widely understood, sometimes forgiven. The church fought it. Villages tolerated it. People whispered, gossiped, laughed, and life went on. Because medieval people weren't that different from us. They desired, they messed up, they took risks, they paid prices, and every once in a while, they fell in love for real and did whatever they had to do to hold on to it. We've covered courtship, sex before marriage, and the blurry lines between love and obligation. Now, let's walk through what happened when two medieval villagers finally tied the knot, and what that meant for the wedding night. Forget roses and candlelight. A peasant wedding in the medieval period was a blend of ritual, public spectacle, and quite literally, community surveillance. Everyone was watching because your marriage didn't just belong to you, it belonged to the village, the church, and sometimes even the Lord. And what happened after the vows? The bed, the moment everyone waited for, not out of romance, but for validation. Weddings were public. Very public. A medieval village wedding didn't happen behind chapel doors or under silk canopies. It took place at the church door. Literally, the couple would stand at the entrance, often in front of the entire village, and exchange vows in front of a priest and witnesses. This was called a sponsalia de praesenti, a present tense agreement to marry. Once spoken, those vows were binding. The ceremony was brief. There might be prayers, a blessing, the giving of a ring if the family could afford one, and maybe a small coin passed as a sign of good faith. But it wasn't grand. Afterward came the procession, a walk through the village, or to the couple's new home, where the real celebration began. Feasting, drinking, and songs you can set print. Peasant weddings weren't fancy, but they weren't quiet either. You might find tables covered in bread, cheese, ale, roasted meat if someone slaughtered a pig, and maybe even sweetmeats if there'd been a good harvest. The celebration was rowdy. Ale flowed. Jokes flew. Songs were sung, many of them extremely lewd. In some areas, guests sang ribald songs about sex, marriage, and fertility. One common joke was to make suggestive toasts to the couple's future children, or joke about how inexperienced the groom might be. These weren't polite parties. They were earthy, communal, and focused heavily on one thing, the couple's consummation. Because until sex happened, the marriage wasn't set real. Straight to bed. The bedding ceremony. See, the feast came, the bedding ceremony. This was exactly what it sounds like. The bride and groom were taken to their bed, often by a group of singing, shouting, teasing villagers, and either tucked in or stripped, depending on the custom. Yes, stripped. In many communities, bedding the couple was public theater. The guests might escort the couple to bed while singing obscene ballads, remove the bride's gown and the groom's tunic, joking all the while, stay to see the couple kiss or lie down together, leave, then return in the morning to see if the bed was marked. There were variations. In some places, only a few elders stayed behind. In others, everyone crowded in to watch the first act of consummation begin, though they usually left before anything explicit. Still, the message was clear. Everyone knew what you were doing, and that knowledge was important. Why public bedding mattered? The bedding wasn't just a fun tradition. It served legal and religious functions. The church held that a marriage became sacramentally valid only after consummation, so seeing the couple enter bed together, especially in front of witnesses, was a way of protecting both parties. If Euriceps, why it mattered. For the bride, if her husband later tried to annul the marriage, she could prove they'd consummated it with witnesses. For the groom, betting in public helped prove the woman was his legitimate wife, especially if property or inheritance was involved. For the village, it showed that the marriage was real and recognized by the community. In a world with no paperwork and no honeymoon suite, the bed was the marriage certificate. Virgins seft blood, proof of purity or myth. Here steps a darker part. In some places, especially among wealthier peasants or the lower gentry, the morning after the wedding came with an expectation, proof of virginity. This usually meant showing blood on the sheets. If the bride bled during intercourse, it was considered confirmation that she'd been a virgin. The family might even display the sheets publicly, hang them from the window, or present them to elders. If there was no blood, questions followed. Was the bride already deflowered? Was the groom impotent? Was there fraud? This pressure led to all kinds of outcomes. Some brides faked the blood, using animal entrails, red dye, or even stabbing themselves lightly. Others were forced into examinations by midwives or priests. The obsession with virginity could be brutal, and the shame, if a girl failed this test, could follow her for life, even if she was innocent. What if consummation didn't instead happen? Sometimes the couple didn't or couldn't complete the act. Maybe the groom was nervous. Maybe one of them was unwilling. Maybe they just didn't know how. In these cases, the marriage could be declared incomplete. There are records of couples taken back to the priest days later, asked why the marriage hadn't been consummated. In extreme cases, a doctor or wise woman might be called in to examine the man's equipment or the woman's anatomy. If it turned out the man was impotent, the marriage could be annulled. And yes, there were court cases where a man had to prove his potency in public or in front of officials. These were humiliating, invasive, and sometimes farcical. The stakes were high. Without consummation, a woman could be sent back to her parents. The dowry might be returned. Any children from later unions might be declared illegitimate. Private desire in a public world. Through all of this, the ceremony, the betting, the blood, the gossip, what did the bride and groom actually feel? We'll never fully know, but not all medieval marriages were arranged. Many couples, especially among peasants, chose each other freely. Some were in love. Others were simply compatible. A few were resigned. And even within this deeply public system, moments of tenderness crept through. Some couples snuck away after the feast. Some whispered promises to each other before the crowd arrived. Some laughed at the absurdity of being tucked into bed by their neighbors. Because here's the thing, sex was everywhere, but intimacy was rare. In a culture obsessed with proving, performing, and policing sex, real connection often happened in the quiet moments, between the rituals, behind the laughter, beneath the rough spun sheets. When the curtain fell, by morning the couple was married in every sense. If things went well, the village celebrated them. If not, they might be mocked, or worse, shunned. But either way, the rules had been followed. The public vows had been made. The bed had been shared. The sheets had been examined. The couple returned to daily life, farming, tending animals, raising children, with a new title, husband and wife. And the village, it kept watching, because in medieval life, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a social contract, a legal commitment, a public performance. But beneath all that, it was still human, awkward, tender, sometimes joyful, sometimes not, just like today. Marriage might have been sacred, but fidelity, that was a whole different story. Medieval Europe preached monogamy and marital duty with fire and brimstone, but behind church walls and within castle courtyards, people were bending the rules. Affairs happened between peasants, nobles, clergy, even queens. Some were discreet, most were dangerous. Let's start with the temptation itself. Why did people cheat in a world where sin meant hell and being caught could mean death? Because lust didn't care about theology, and neither did loneliness. Love and loneliness unlocked marriages. In most of medieval Europe, marriages weren't built on romance. They were often arranged, practical, and aimed at preserving land, money, or status. This meant plenty of husbands and wives simply didn't like each other or were separated by age, class, or desire. For noble women, it was even worse. They were often married off as teens to much older men, locked in cold stone halls, tasked with producing heirs and keeping quiet. Peasant women fared better emotionally, but still, marriage was work. Emotional connection wasn't guaranteed. Intimacy wasn't expected. So when desire came knocking, through a handsome stable boy or a widowed neighbor, it was more than physical. It was a taste of something forbidden. Yes, but also something real. Affairs among the peasantry, risky business. Among peasants, extramarital affairs were common enough to be noticed and feared. The church called it adultery, and it was a mortal sin. But enforcement was tricky. Villagers lived close together, privacy was non-existent, and gossip spread faster than fire in a thatched roof. If a married woman was seen too often in another man's home, questions arose. If a baby was born with the wrong hair color or timing, rumors flew. Punishment varied. In some towns, adulterers were fined heavily, payable to both the church and the injured husband, beaten or publicly humiliated, sometimes forced to crawl through the streets, excommunicated, banned from communion and community. Women bore the brunt. A married woman caught cheating was seen as violating not just her vows, but her husband's honor and even the village's moral standing. And here's the twist. If a man had sex with a married woman, he was punished. But if he slept with an unmarried woman, it was often seen as a lesser sin, even if it left her pregnant. Church courts and bedroom secrets. Adultery wasn't just a private matter. It often landed people in church courts, where ecclesiastical officials judged sins of the flesh. These weren't high-drama trials. They were deeply awkward hearings, where villagers were forced to testify about who had slept with whom, when, and where. Some notable examples from court records. A woman accused of adultery who swore she only entered the mansep's house to borrow salt. A man caught climbing out of a married woman's sep's window and claiming he was checking the thatch. A priest forced to admit he'd fathered 3 children with a parishioner. Church courts relied on witnesses, but also gossip, timing of births, and even bed linen inspections. If proven guilty, punishment might include whipping at the church door, wearing a shame mask or rough tunic for weeks, walking barefoot through the village while everyone watched. But if the accused had power or friends in high places, the whole thing might quietly disappear. Adultery among the nobles, cloaks, daggers, and poisons. Now step into the castles, and things get darker. Among the nobility, affairs were even more dangerous. Why? Because they threatened inheritance and power. A noble woman having an affair could call her husband's lineage into question, If her child wasn't his, the bloodline could be compromised, and with it, estates, titles, and alliances. So when highborn women cheated, they did so at great risk. In 1313, Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy, sisters-in-law to the King of France, were caught in a scandal that shook Europe. They were accused of sleeping with two knights. The men were flayed alive. The women were locked in towers. One died. One disappeared. The message was clear. Noble adultery wasn't scandal. It was treason. For men, the double standard kicked in. Noblemen had mistresses freely. Kings kept entire courts of concubines. As long as their wives produced heirs and didn't complain, no one blinked. But some men went further, seducing the wives of their allies or rivals. These affairs were political weapons. If discovered, they could lead to war, assassination, or exile. Coded love letters and secret doors. Affairs required stealth, and medieval lovers got creative. They used estrodes, coded letters, written in poetry, or using religious metaphors, meeting spots in chapels, cellars, or forests, hidden doors between castle chambers, especially in large keeps. One noblewoman in France reportedly carved symbols into trees to mark where she'd meet her lover. Another had a maid leave her windows unlatched at night and scatter flower petals to signal safety. The effort was enormous. The consequences were deadly. But for some, the pull of connection, of love or lust, was worth risking everything. When it wasn't set love, not all affairs were romantic. Some were transactional, others were survival. The married woman might sleep with a lord to protect her husband from taxes or conscription. A peasant girl might be coerced into an affair with her landlord in exchange for food or leniency. Consent was murky in a world where power was so uneven, and for women, being labeled an adulteress, even unfairly, could ruin their lives. Men could accuse their wives as a pretext for divorce or punishment, even if the woman was innocent. Some were beaten, others locked up. A few were even executed under secular laws for bringing dishonor to their families. Affairs weren't just sins of passion. They were battlegrounds for control, gender, and survival. The guilt, the fear, the fire. What about the people themselves? The ones who broke their vows? Many were racked with guilt. The church drilled the message in adultery would send you to hell, eternal flames, demonic torment. Some confessed, others sought penance. A few paid for indulgences payments to the church to reduce time in purgatory, but many lived with secrets they never confessed. Silent glances, letters burned, babies born with questionable lineage, and others they didn't set regretted at all. Because behind all the judgment and danger, some people just fell in love. Wrong time, wrong person, but real all the same. When adultery was exposed, it didn't just end in heartbreak. In medieval Europe, it ended in ruin. A scandal didn't stay behind closed doors. It spilled into the streets, into church sermons, into court records. It destroyed reputations, ended marriages, and sometimes claimed lives, because adultery wasn't just seen as a betrayal of a spouse. It was seen as an offense against God, community, and the fragile web of social order. Let Seps walk through the fallout: confession, denial, and the perils of being believed. So, let's say an affair was discovered. Someone whispered. A child looked different. A door creaked at the wrong time. Now what? The first phase was almost always accusation. Sometimes the betrayed spouse brought it. Other times a neighbor or a priest did. The accused would be hauled before a church court or a local magistrate. Evidence? Often thin. But medieval justice didn't need much. If the accused confessed, they might be offered leniency, especially if they were poor and penitent. But if they denied it, the burden of proof was bizarrely flexible. They might be asked to swear on a holy relic that they were innocent, produce oath helpers to vouch for them, undergo ordeals, physical tests to prove their truthfulness, like holding hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water. If the wounds healed quickly, God had spoken. It was terrifying and unjust, especially for women, because once you were accused, the court of public opinion usually decided the verdict before the gavel ever fell. What the punishment actually looked like. If found guilty, the consequences ranged from humiliating to horrifying. For commoners, punishment often involved public penance, like standing barefoot in the town square with a sign around your neck, adulterer, being forced to wear specific clothing, a burlap tunic, a colored hood, signaling your shame, flogging or beating, often performed on church steps or in the marketplace, heavy fines which could bankrupt a poor family. Some villages even had a cucking stool, a special chair used to dunk adulterers, especially women in rivers or ponds, as crowds jeered. It wasn't just physical punishment, it was reputation death. Adulterers were seen as untrustworthy, sinful, corrupted. Women often couldn't remarry. Men lost property or were driven out of the village. For nobles, things got bloodier, especially when pride and politics were involved. Kings and lords could imprison their unfaithful spouses, sometimes for life, annul the marriage and seize dowries or land, kill the lover, often brutally and publicly. One 14th century nobleman had his wife's lover castrated, then hanged in front of her window. In Spain, noblemen sometimes invoked the right of the sword, killing both adulterers without trial. The law rarely interfered. In fact, it often supported such actions as the husband defending his honor. The role of the church: sin, redemption, and a heavy hand. The church held adultery as a mortal sin, second only to murder in some sermons. It saw marriage as a holy bond, and violating it invited divine wrath. Priests thundered against adulterers. From the pulpit, confession was required, and penance was harsh. In some regions, a repentant adulterer might be ordered to go on pilgrimage, walking barefoot hundreds of miles as penance, donate money or property to the church as spiritual compensation, fast for weeks or months, living on bread and water alone, refrained from communion for years. But there was a strange double standard. If a priest was caught in an affair, the consequences could be lighter unless he made enemies. Then it could be catastrophic. And if a noble patron was involved in the affair, the church often looked the other way, especially if gold changed hands. Still, for most people, the church's judgment was heavy and public, and the spiritual terror it created of hell, fire, eternal shame was arguably worse than any earthly punishment. When jealousy turned to violence, sometimes adultery didn't go through the courts at all. Sometimes it ended with a knife. Crimes of passion were real. Husbands catching their wives in the act often killed both parties and then claimed justifiable homicide. In some parts of Europe, especially in Italy and France, this was even legalized. A man who caught his wife cheating could kill her and the lover and face no penalty as long as it happened in the moment of discovery. That gave jealous or violent men enormous power. A man could suspect infidelity, stage a discovery, and murder with impunity. Wives had no such rights. A woman who killed her unfaithful husband, she was a murderess, a sinner, a witch, sometimes. The imbalance wasn't just legal, it was cultural. A man's honor was tied to his wife's fidelity. A woman's safety depended on her silence. Wives wrongfully accused. And here sits where it gets even darker. Some women were falsely accused for convenience, for revenge, or just because someone didn't like them. A husband who wanted a divorce claimed she was unfaithful. A neighbor jealous of a woman's beauty or fortune whisper that she had a lover. Once accused, the stain was nearly impossible to scrub clean. In 13th century England, there are cases of women being exiled from villages after accusations with no evidence. In some German towns, women had to carry letters of innocence from their priests to prove they weren't adulteresses. It was that just social. It was economic. A woman accused of infidelity could lose her dowry, custody of her children, the right to inherit her husband's property. It was a weapon, and it was used often. The children of adultery. And what about the children? A child born out of wedlock, or whose paternity was in doubt, faced a hard road. In noble families, a child seen as illegitimate might be, disinherited, sent to a monastery or nunnery to be hidden away, claimed as a bastard, and denied the family name. In peasant villages, the stigma was softer but still real. A child born to an adulterous mother might be teased, excluded, or seen as cursed, but many were simply absorbed into families. Love, need, and community often won out over purity. Still, medieval Europe never stopped tracking lineage. Bloodlines mattered, and adultery made bloodlines messy. Shame that never died. Here sets the cruelest part. Even after penance, even after confession, even after decades passed, a person branded as an adulterer rarely escaped the stain. Their grandchildren might still hear the whispers. Their names might be left off family records. They were reminders of failure, of shame, of sin. Adultery in medieval Europe wasn't a secret tryst. It was a social earthquake, and its aftershocks could last for generations. Let's leave behind the villagers and their whispered gossip. Because when the stakes involved crowns, kingdoms, and dynastic power, adultery wasn't just a sin or a scandal. It was political warfare. And unlike peasants who got flogged or dunked in a river, the rich and powerful had the luxury of turning lust into strategy and consequences into history. This is where sex became a weapon, and affairs had the power to topple entire regimes. Queen Isabella and the lovers who broke a kingdom. Let's start with one of the juiciest tales in medieval Europe, Queen Isabella of France and her infamous affair with Roger Mortimer. Isabella was married to King Edward II of England. Their marriage was a cold one, and not just emotionally. Edward was widely believed to prefer the company of his male favorites, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the Younger. Isabella, sidelined and humiliated, had enough. In 1325, while visiting her native France, she met Roger Mortimer, an ambitious English noble who had recently escaped imprisonment in the Tower of London. They became lovers, secretly at first, then very, very publicly. In 1326, they invaded England together, deposed Edward II, and took control of the kingdom. Edward was imprisoned, possibly tortured, and later died under mysterious, horrifying circumstances, some say with a red-hot poker. Isabella ruled England as regent alongside Mortimer for 4 years. Their rule was marked by lavish excess, brutal suppression of dissent, and growing paranoia. But the tides turned. In 1330, Isabella's teenage son, Edward III, led a coup. Mortimer was arrested, charged with treason and adultery, and hanged. Isabella was spared death, but was confined to a life of quiet exile. What started as an affair became a full-blown coup d'etat. Lust, betrayal, regicide. It was Shakespeare before Shakespeare. The affair that ignited the 100 Years' Cyst War. Next up, a royal sex scandal, so convoluted it triggered one of the longest wars in European history. Meet Queen Margaret of Burgundy. In the early 1300s, she was married to Louis X of France, heir to the French throne. But Margaret was accused, along with her sisters-in-law, of having affairs with knights from the royal household in a scandal known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The allegations came from Isabella of France, yes, the same one from earlier, who had married into England and noticed her sisters-in-law exchanging embroidered purses with 2 suspiciously handsome men. A secret investigation ensued. The knights were arrested, tortured, and confessed. They were flayed alive and hanged in public. Margaret was imprisoned and died soon after, probably murdered. Now here's the twist. Because her daughter Joan was suddenly considered of questionable legitimacy. When Louis X died, the crown passed not to Joan, but to his brother, and then eventually to Philip VI. This ignited a dynastic dispute between the French and the English royal houses. Edward III of England, a grandson of the French king, believed his claim to the French throne was stronger, and that dispute kicked off the 100 Years' War. All of it, from royal infidelity to execution to decades of bloodshed, stemmed from one hidden affair in a tower. The poisoned passion of Eleanor of Aquitaine. One of the most powerful women of the medieval world, Eleanor of Aquitaine was married first to King Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England. Her marriage to Louis was a disaster. They fought constantly, and Eleanor was widely accused of being too free, too headstrong, too sexual. Rumors swirled that she had an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, while on crusade. That may not have been true, but it did lead Louis to annul the marriage. Then she married Henry, and things got even more volatile. Their passion burned hot, and so did their fury. Henry took several mistresses, most famously Rosamund Clifford, and Eleanor seethed. Eventually, she helped her sons rebel against their father. Was this vengeance? Political ambition? Probably both. Either way, Eleanor's actions helped ignite one of England's most turbulent civil conflicts. She was imprisoned for 16 years, but later returned to the political stage and ruled as regent, while her son Richard the Lionheart fought abroad. Eleanor's tangled romances weren't just gossip. They were the backbone of dynastic power plays across France and England. Adultery as a royal escape hatch. For medieval queens trapped in political marriages, adultery was sometimes the only power move left. It could offer a powerful ally as in the case of Isabella and Mortimer, leverage over a husband, an heir who wasn't weak, sickly, or despised, but the gamble was deadly. If discovered, queens risked execution, often by burning or beheading, imprisonment for life, being erased from official records. One notorious example, Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, a bit post-medieval, but still relevant, was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Historians widely believe the charges were fabricated, but they were politically useful. She was executed in 1536, clearing the way for Henry to marry Jane Seymour and try for a male heir again. Even queens weren't safe, especially queens. When kings cheated openly and the church looked away, while queens walked a tightrope, kings had a free pass. Most kings had official mistresses, multiple illegitimate children, entire households devoted to their sexual pursuits. It wasn't just tolerated, it was often celebrated as a sign of virility and divine favor. Charles the Peasant of Navarre had a mistress whose quarters were attached directly to the royal chapel. Philip IV of France had so many affairs that court records stopped bothering to document them. And the church? It often winked and moved on. As long as the king supported clerical power and made donations, his lust was considered a private matter. But it was instead always so quiet. Sometimes, kings' affairs sparked civil unrest, noble rebellions, or even assassination attempts. Jealous husbands, furious sons, humiliated noble houses. A king's affair might be pleasurable in private, but it was volatile in public. Legacy of royal adultery. Adultery at the top of the social pyramid didn't look like peasant scandals. There were no cucking stools, no barefoot penance. Instead, the consequences were wars, dynastic collapse, civil wars, and rewritten lineages. It mattered not just because it was salacious, but because it determined who ruled, who inherited, and who died. Medieval Europe's history of adultery wasn't just about love or lust. It was about power, and sometimes all it took was a kiss in the wrong chamber or a glance in the wrong garden for an entire kingdom to burn. If you want to understand medieval sexuality, don't start with what people were doing in bed. Start with what they were told to believe. Because for women, sex wasn't just a biological act, it was a moral identity. You were either a virgin or a whore, a holy bride of Christ, or a sinful vessel of temptation. There wasn't much room in between, and this rigid binary shaped everything from marriage laws to medical beliefs to public punishments. Let's dig into it. The cult of virginity. From the church's point of view, the holiest woman was a woman who never had sex at all. The Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, was the ultimate model, pure, obedient, untouched. And this wasn't just a symbolic ideal, it had real-world consequences for women. Girls were taught from a young age that their virginity was their most valuable possession. Losing it outside of marriage made them unmarriageable, spiritually defiled, socially ruined. In some regions, a girl's family could demand a fine or even initiate legal action if a suitor deflowered her and then refused to marry her. And in courts, a woman's testimony was often taken less seriously if she wasn't a virgin. The logic? If she couldn't protect her virtue, how could she be trusted in anything else? It's horrifying logic, but it was pervasive. Virginity tests. The medieval myth. You've probably heard stories about medieval virginity tests. Unfortunately, they weren't just myths. Women were sometimes subjected to visual inspections by midwives, bedding ceremonies to prove consummation, trials to check for an intact hymen, which medically speaking was based on pure fiction. Some believed virginity could be proven by a woman's sep's ability to hold her breath for a long time, whether she bled during her first intercourse, the tightness of her skin, sit. None of this was remotely scientific, but these tests were used to determine inheritance rights, annulments, and even witchcraft accusations. And the worst part? Even if a woman passed the test, she might still be seen as suspect. Virginity, in many minds, was less about the body and more about behavior. Too confident? Suspicious? Too quiet? Citing something? It was a lose-lose. The virgin martyrs. To drive the ideal home, the church celebrated virgin saints who died rather than lose their chastity. One famous example, Saint Agnes, a 12-year-old girl who was dragged naked through the streets of Rome after refusing to marry. Legend says her hair miraculously grew to cover her body. She was eventually executed. Or Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who refused the emperor's advances and was tortured on a spiked wheel, later known as the Catherine Wheel. Or Saint Lucy, who gouged out her own eyes to avoid being married off. These weren't subtle messages. They were moral propaganda, warning girls that the price of sainthood was often suffering, martyrdom, and death. In medieval art, these saints were almost always portrayed with pale skin, flowing hair, and innocent expressions. They weren't just holy, they were sexualized symbols of purity. The paradox was this: the Virgin was idealized, but also eroticized, especially in male-dominated theology and literature. Women as temptresses. Now let's flip the script. If the Virgin was the angel, the sexually experienced woman was the devil's tool. The figure of Eve, the first woman, loomed large. She was blamed not just for original sin, but for bringing desire into the world. She ate the apple. She seduced Adam. She ruined paradise. This myth bled into every aspect of medieval thought. Women were seen as naturally lustful. Men were the rational ones, trying to resist temptation. Female beauty was considered dangerous, a spiritual trap. In sermons, popular poems, and court records, we see this theme over and over. A man sins. A woman caused it. She must be punished, whether it was a peasant girl or a queen. Once a woman stepped outside the virgin category, she was vulnerable to accusation, control, and shame. Medieval misogyny in medicine. Even medieval medicine reflected this view. Doctors believed the female body was cold and moist compared to the male sips, hot and dry. This imbalance supposedly made women emotionally unstable, sexually insatiable, spiritually weak. It was thought that women needed regular sex to stay healthy, but also that too much sex would make them hysterical or possessed. Catch that contradiction? This led to a brutal cycle. Women were told to be sexually passive, but also blamed if they weren't. They were supposed to desire nothing, but were treated as constantly dangerous because of their alleged desire. It's like locking someone in a room, accusing them of escape, and then punishing them for trying the door. Virginity and marriage markets. For noble families, a daughter's virginity had economic value. It could be traded for land, titles, or alliances. In many aristocratic marriages, girls were wed between 12 and 15 years old. Their husbands were often decades older. A nobleman might demand proof of virginity before a marriage contract was finalized. If he later suspected she wasn't a virgin, he could seek annulment, accuse her of fraud, or worse. And once married, she had no control over her body. Marital rape wasn't just legal, it was expected. If she refused sex, she could be accused of being a bad wife, or even a heretic. Virginity wasn't about innocence. It was a commodity, one you could sell once, and only once. The impossible ideal. So here's the core tension. The ideal woman had to be sexually pure, but also ready to serve her husband. She had to be silent, but always obedient, attractive, but not too attractive, fertile, but never lustful. It was an impossible role, and failure to live up to it, real or perceived, could cost a woman her reputation, her future, or her life. We'll get deeper into the whore side of this equation in the next section. But for now, just know this. The medieval world didn't just police women's actions, it policed their identities. And at the center of that was virginity. So we've covered the virgin. Now let's talk about the other half of the medieval sexual binary, the prostitute. Here's the thing. Despite all the religious preaching about chastity, prostitution wasn't just tolerated in medieval Europe. In many cities, it was regulated, taxed, and legally protected. The church condemned it, morality hated it, but governments, they quietly counted on it. Let's break this down. Sex work is a necessary evil. There was a popular medieval saying, prostitution is to society what the sewer is to the palace. Take it away, and everything will overflow. Crude? Yes, but brutally honest. Most towns and cities believed that without prostitution, men would commit worse sins, like rape or adultery with married women. So authorities framed brothels as a way to contain male lust, like a pressure valve. Theologians called it a lesser sin, still bad, but better than chaos. Even St. Augustine, one of the most influential Christian thinkers, argued that while prostitution was morally wrong, trying to eliminate it would lead to greater disorder. This led to an awkward, often hypocritical arrangement. The church preached purity. The state licensed brothels. Everyone pretended the contradiction didn't exist. How legal brothels worked. In many medieval towns, especially in France, Germany, and parts of Italy, brothels were government-approved businesses. Here's stats what that looked like. Location brothels were kept in specific districts, often outside city walls or near rivers, which conveniently kept the smell away. Regulations: brothel owners had to pay licensing fees and taxes. Some towns required them to follow hygiene rules or avoid operating on holy days. Uniforms: prostitutes were often required to wear specific colors, like yellow or distinctive belts or veils, to mark them as sex workers. Curfews and conduct. In some places, prostitutes had to be indoors by a certain hour. They were forbidden from attending church or public festivals. And yet, despite these restrictions, sex workers were often essential to the local economy. Inns, taverns, bathhouses, and clothing merchants all benefited from the trade. It was an open secret. Sin paid the bills. Who became a medieval sex worker? Short answer: women with no better options. Many prostitutes were widows or abandoned wives, orphan girls, poor women unable to find a husband, survivors of war, famine, or plague. For some, it was a temporary arrangement, a way to make money during hard times. For others, it became a lifelong occupation. And unlike the virgin ideal, prostitutes were often granted a twisted kind of freedom. They could own property. In some places, they were instead legally tied to husbands. They had more control over their daily routines than married women, but that freedom came at a cost: constant stigma, violence, and risk of disease. The church sets uneasy relationship with sex workers. The church officially condemned prostitution, but individual clergy were often less consistent. Some monasteries and church officials ran brothels for profit. Others frequented them. There are plenty of records of bishops caught in compromising situations, but at the same time, many Christian texts emphasize the idea that sex workers were redeemable sinners. Think Mary Magdalene, often incorrectly portrayed as a reformed prostitute. This led to a lot of contradictory behavior. Priests preaching repentance to sex workers by day and visiting brothels at night. Monasteries collecting brothel taxes while funding anti-vice campaigns. Churches offering penance rituals for women who wanted to leave the life, but giving them no real alternative. In some towns, penitent sex workers had to shave their heads, wear sackcloth, or crawl to the altar on hands and knees as part of public repentance ceremonies that are just spiritual blackmail disguised as salvation. Violence and vulnerability. Despite the legal protection in some cities, prostitutes were still deeply vulnerable. They faced physical abuse from clients, theft or cheating by brothel owners, arrests if they stepped outside legal bounds, no recourse if raped or attacked. In some regions, a prostitute couldn't testify in court against a man. Her word was considered invalid, and if she became pregnant, her options were bleak. Many were forced to give up their children or raise them in brothels. Some were forcibly sterilized or exiled. Sex work wasn't just stigmatized, it was criminalized when convenient, weaponized when useful, and ignored when uncomfortable. Brothels as entertainment hubs. Interestingly, not all brothels were seedy dens. In cities like Paris and London, some operated like high-end clubs. They offered live music, baths and massages, food and drink, private rooms with velvet cushions and incense. These places attracted nobles, merchants, clergy, and foreign travelers. They were often hubs of gossip, deal-making, and informal diplomacy. Some even had menus detailing services and prices. It was sex work, but with a touch of theater. And yes, some women in these establishments had power. Courtesans with rich patrons could own property, influence politics, and commission art. But they were the exception, not the rule. Public punishment and shaming. Despite the legal status of many brothels, sex workers could still be humiliated, especially if accused of overstepping their place. Common punishments included parading through town in chains, being dunked in rivers, a ritual known as cucking, wearing donkey ears or tails as mockery, being forced to stand naked at the city gates. The goal wasn't justice, it was spectacle, a warning to other women. Even worse, these punishments often came not from customers or town councils, but from angry wives, neighbors, or rival prostitutes. The system was set up to pit women against each other, virgin versus whore, wife versus mistress, sinner versus saint, between two worlds. So where did that leave the average sex worker? Stuck. She was needed by society, but despised by it, used by men, but blamed by women, condemned by the church, but taxed by the state. There was no clear path out. Some managed to leave the trade, marry, or join convents after intense repentance. Others died in poverty, buried in unmarked graves. The medieval prostitute lived in the shadow of the virgin ideal. She was the cautionary tale, the necessary evil, the face of forbidden desire. But she was also a survivor, a worker, a woman navigating a brutal world with the few tools available to her. Not every medieval woman was a cloistered virgin or a woman for hire. Most lived somewhere in between, married, widowed, remarried, or trapped in domestic roles that left little room for independence, let alone sexual freedom. This section is about those women, the everyday wives, the household managers, the mothers, the ones historians often overlook. Let's strip back the assumptions and see what sex actually looked like inside medieval marriages and what happened when a husband died. Marriage was a legal contract, not a love story. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was about land, inheritance, alliances, and legitimacy. When a noble married, they weren't just getting a spouse, they were sealing a treaty. For common folk, the stakes were smaller, but the logic was the same. A wife meant help around the farm. A husband meant economic stability and protection. Children meant a future workforce. Love, if it existed, was a bonus. And here's something crucial. Sex was part of the contract. By marrying, both husband and wife were promising to have sex regularly. It was called the marital debt. Refusing to fulfill it could be grounds for annulment or social shame. Even the church accepted this. While priests preached celibacy as the holiest state, they acknowledged that married people had a religious duty to have sex, especially if it led to children. The rules of bedroom conduct. Sex within marriage wasn't a free-for-all. There were strict, often bizarre, rules about what was acceptable. Clerical writers and moralists drew up long lists. Only the missionary position was permitted. Sex had to be for procreation, not pleasure. No sex during Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays, or while a woman was menstruating or pregnant. Oral or anal sex. Both were considered mortal sins, even in marriage. Too much enthusiasm, suspicious, could be a sign of demonic influence. Couples were expected to be functional, not joyful. In fact, some texts warned that enjoying sex too much, even with your spouse, was dangerous to your soul. So what did people actually do? They bent the rules, like people always do, but they had to hide it under layers of guilt, ritual, and shame. Women's pleasure, ignored or demonized. Let's talk about female pleasure, or more accurately, how often it was ignored, feared, or twisted into something sinister. For centuries, many believed that a woman had to orgasm in order to conceive. This led to some practical incentives for making sure wives were satisfied, but it also created suspicion. If a woman became pregnant from rape, some argued she must have enjoyed it, or else conception couldn't occur, a deeply flawed and dangerous belief that showed up in both church courts and secular law. At the same time, a wife who wanted sex too often might be labeled a nymphomaniac, possessed by demons, a threat to her husband's soul. The medieval world was not comfortable with the idea of a sexually assertive woman. A quiet, submissive wife was ideal. A curious one was a problem. So even in marriage, women's sexuality was under constant surveillance by husbands, by priests, and by society. Pregnancy, birth, and fear of infertility, sex and reproduction were inseparable in the medieval mind, so it's no surprise that pregnancy was the main point of marriage. But getting pregnant was risky, so was childbirth. No prenatal care, no antibiotics, no pain relief beyond herbal concoctions and prayer. Women were often pregnant 10, 12, even 15 times in their lives, especially among the nobility, where heirs were everything. But many died during childbirth. Many more lost children in infancy. This created a weird tension. Women were expected to reproduce constantly, but also blamed if they couldn't set. Infertility was usually seen as the woman's fault, even though male infertility was just as common. Accusations ranged from being cursed, sinful, or having a cold womb. Yes, that was a thing. And if you were a woman who didn't want to have children, you had no real options. Contraception was condemned by the church, and abortion was a punishable offense, sometimes with death. So sex for many wives was less about intimacy and more about obligation, risk, and survival. Widowhood, a glimmer of power. Now here's steps where things get interesting. If you were a woman and your husband died, you suddenly had rights you never had before. Widows could own property, run businesses, choose not to remarry, control their own dowries and estates. In many towns, widows became moneylenders, shopkeepers, or landlords. Some even funded churches, hospitals, or schools. But there was a catch. To keep those rights, widows had to stay single. Remarriage often meant losing autonomy again, because your new husband would take over everything. This made the widow a complicated figure, respected, but sometimes feared, independent, but suspicious, free, but lonely, and yes, some did take lovers. Some became concubines. Some entered convents. Some lived quietly with other widows in all-female households. For the first time, they could make choices. Love lust in the private reality. What about love? It's easy to assume all medieval marriages were cold, duty-bound arrangements, but that's not the full picture. Letters, poems, and journals, especially from the later Middle Ages, revealed genuine affection between spouses. Not always, but often enough to challenge the stereotype. Some husbands mourned their wives deeply. Some wives wrote passionate letters to husbands at war. Some couples joked, argued, touched, made peace. It wasn't always romantic, but it wasn't always bleak either. Sex, too, was sometimes tender or awkward or joyful or painful, real. Just because the church frowned on pleasure doesn't mean people didn't find ways to enjoy it. Between survival and suppression, to sum up, for the average medieval wife, sex was rarely about pleasure. It was about proving fertility, avoiding suspicion, surviving childbirth, fulfilling duty. But behind all the expectations, some women found love, others found grief. Some found independence in widowhood. Others got trapped in abusive homes. And while virginity and prostitution dominated medieval thinking, most women just lived in between, navigating rules, dodging judgment, finding what space they could in a system designed to control them. These were the silent majority, the ones who kept the world turning while philosophers argued about angels and sin. They're harder to see in the history books, but they were there, in kitchens, in beds, in fields, in churches, living complicated lives between shame and survival. Imagine this. It's a chilly Sunday morning in a small village. The bells of the parish church are tolling. Inside, a man or woman kneels in a narrow wooden booth. On the other side of a screen sits a priest. No eye contact, just whispered words. But what's being said is charged, intimate, desperate, or shameful. Because here's where the truth about medieval sex finally surfaces. Not in public, not in brothels, not in bed, but in confession. Welcome to the part of medieval life that most people never wrote down because they didn't have to. They confessed it. Sex was always a sin, but not always the same sin. The Catholic Church had plenty to say about sex in the Middle Ages, and it said most of it was sinful, but not all sins were equal. Here sits how the hierarchy worked: sin, severity, why it was bad, adultery, mortal sin, broke the marriage contract, fornication, unmarried sex, serious but common, pleasure without procreation, masturbation, mortal sin, wasted seed, homosexual acts, mortal sin, non-procreative, unnatural, bestiality. Among worst sins, seen as a blasphemy against nature, marital sex for pleasure only, venial, sometimes mortal, distracted from God, tainted by lust. So even if you were married, sex was risky. If you did it for the wrong reasons or in the wrong way, it might still land you in hell, which meant everyone needed confession. The invention of the private confessional. Private confession wasn't always the norm. For centuries, people confessed publicly in church in front of witnesses, but by the 13th century, the church had changed its approach. Pope Innocent III made private confession mandatory at least once a year. That meant everyone, from peasants to nobles, had to regularly sit across from a priest and list every sexual thought, act, and temptation they'd experienced. No exceptions, no privacy, no room to lie, at least in theory. What did people confess? We know what was confessed because priests had manuals. These were confession guides filled with extremely detailed and sometimes shockingly explicit questions. Some examples: have you had intercourse with your spouse for pleasure alone? Have you touched yourself? Have you performed the act in the wrong position? Have you used potions or herbs to prevent conception? Have you had relations with someone of your own sex or an animal? These manuals weren't written for titillation, but they reveal a lot about what priests expected or feared people were doing. In other words, they're an accidental sexual census, and they hint at a messy, confused, often desperate reality. People did masturbate. They did sleep around. They did break rules. And then they told their priests about it. The role of the priest: judge, therapist, spy. In theory, confession was about forgiveness. But in practice, confessors had immense power. They could mix absenter, deny absolution, impose heavy penance, advise on marriage, separation, or annulment, demand repeated confessions if they weren't sit convinced, and they were often the only people in a village with real literacy or theological training. That meant priests became the moral police of sex, and sometimes not in a good way. Some were compassionate, others were corrupt, using confession to extract gossip, favors, or worse. There were even cases where priests pressured penitents, especially women, into sexual acts as penance or under the guise of spiritual healing. These were rare but real, and the church sometimes punished them harshly. Still, the confessional was a strange paradox. Cosa of Amor, a place of guilt, but also relief, a place of fear, but also truth. Penances, from prayer to pilgrimage. What happened when you confessed? You got a penance, a spiritual sentence meant to cleanse the soul. For minor sexual sins, the penance might be saying a set number of Our Fathers and Hail Marys, fasting on bread and water for a day, giving alms to the poor. For serious offenses, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, the penance could be brutal. Long-term fasting, public humiliation, lengthy pilgrimages, years of celibacy or exile. But here's the interesting part. Confession was usually anonymous and routine, so most people got off with manageable penances, and they came back again and again, because confession wasn't just about rules. It was therapy before therapy existed. It let people speak the unspeakable, to say, I did this. I thought that. I don't know why. And sometimes the priest just listened. Confession as control and as catharsis. The church used confession to control sexuality. By making everyone confess, it created a system of surveillance. Every desire, every touch, every fantasy was something that could be interrogated and judged. But this also meant the church knew what people were doing. The manuals are full of real behaviors, married couples experimenting, teenagers discovering their bodies, widows taking lovers, men cheating during feasts or festivals. Sex wasn't rare or hidden. It was everywhere, and confession became the only place it could be spoken about safely. And for many, that was a lifeline, a world of secrets and whispers. So what was sex really like for the pious in the Middle Ages? It was complicated, shame-filled, riddled with guilt and surveillance, but also deeply human. People broke rules. They felt bad. They confessed. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they lied. But more often than not, they came to the booth and they whispered their truth. Because in a world where every sexual act carried a moral weight, the confessional wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about being seen. And in the silence of that wooden booth, under the judgment of heaven and the weight of sin, medieval people let their masks fall. For a few minutes, they weren't saints or sinners. They were just people desperate to be heard, to be understood, and maybe, just maybe, to be forgiven. Let's be honest. When the church tells you that sex is sinful, impure, and spiritually dangerous, you start thinking about it more, not less. And in medieval Europe, surrounded by sermons, saints, statues, and suspicion, people's imaginations didn't stop at the church doors. In fact, shame often gave birth to obsession. Confession didn't erase desire. Sometimes it fed it. The forbidden is fascinating. Theologians and monks filled books with warnings, but their warnings often read like catalogs of depravity. Consider this quote from a 14th century confession manual. Beware the woman who bathes too long and invites the devil through her vanity, or the man who, when alone, stirs his loins with idle thoughts and wanders in mind to the flesh of boys, beasts, or his own hand. This wasn't sit pornography, but it worked like a guide to temptation, a grim index of what could go wrong in the human heart. People weren't stupid. They read between the lines, and they started imagining what they'd never experienced. In a strange way, The church had become the most detailed sex educator in town. Only everything it taught was filtered through guilt. Lust in the cloister, nuns, monks, and secret affairs. We like to imagine monasteries as islands of purity, silent halls, celibate men and women living lives of prayer. But real life doesn't work like that, especially not when you lock dozens of hormonal teenagers together for decades. Historical records are full of pregnant nuns, secret lovers sneaking into convents, monks caught with prostitutes, priests, fathering children with servants. Sometimes it was consensual, other times it wasn't. But either way, it happened more often than most people realize. A 14th century investigation in one English abbey found 9 pregnant nuns. The abbess claimed ignorance. The bishop called for repentance. And then nothing changed. Because even in sacred spaces, the pull of the body refused to go away. Erotic visions and holy fantasies. Here's Sis, where things get even stranger. Some of the most devout people in medieval history reported deeply sensual religious visions, especially women. Take Saint Catherine of Siena. She wrote of being spiritually married to Christ in a vision, receiving a ring made of his foreskin. Or Saint Teresa of Avila, whose famous ecstasy involved a beautiful angel thrusting a fiery spear repeatedly into her heart and body, causing her to moan with a mixture of pain and pleasure. These weren't jokes. They were seen as spiritual encounters, but they were undeniably sexual in tone. And scholars still debate, were these suppressed desires breaking through? Was the only safe outlet for female sexuality a vision from God? Either way, these weren't isolated. Nuns and monks often wrote of longing, rapture, surrender, using the same language found in romantic poetry. They weren't sleeping around, but they felt things. And in their writings, we see a kind of emotional and sensual life that the church tried hard to contain, but never quite could. Flagellation and the pleasure of penance. There's another corner of medieval piety that blurs the line between suffering and pleasure, self-flagellation. Many religious orders encouraged it. Believers would whip themselves with cords, sticks, or even chains, either as penance or as a way to feel closer to Christ's suffering. But here sits the complicated truth. Some found it pleasurable, not just spiritually, physically. It wasn't always about guilt. It was about sensation, control, release. And over time, flagellation moved from pure penance to something more emotionally complex, an outlet for guilt, desire, even ecstasy. You can trace a straight line from these practices to later forms of religious eroticism. Even today, certain forms of religious devotion blur pain and transcendence. In the Middle Ages, that boundary was constantly being tested. Sexual nightmares, incubi, succubi, and spiritual rape. What happens when people dream of sex but wake up in terror? Medieval people had a name for it: demonic visitation. Men claimed they were visited by seductive female spirits, succubi, who mounted them in the night. Women said incubi crawled into bed with them, held them down, and used their bodies while they were paralyzed in fear. Today we'd call this sleep paralysis or repressed trauma, but back then it was seen as spiritual warfare. These weren't just nightmares. They were real to those who experienced them, and the church often took them seriously. Confessors might recommend long prayers of protection, burning particular herbs, avoiding meat, alcohol, or hot foods. sleeping with holy relics under the pillow. But in reality, these stories may have masked sexual trauma, fantasy, or internalized guilt. The mind of the medieval penitent was a storm of fear, temptation, and theology. Sex was never just sex. The danger of repression. Let's take a step back. The medieval world wasn't obsessed with sex because it was permissive. It was obsessed because it was terrified. Terrified of temptation. Terrified of impurity. Terrified of what the body might want when the soul wasn't looking. That fear made people imaginative. It made them curious. It made them feel shame. Yes, but also at times liberation. Because when you name your demons, they stop being vague. They become real. And once they spare real, people start talking. In confession. In writing. In whispers. Behind closed doors. And in those moments of confession or conversation or quiet dreaming, medieval people did what humans always do. They created inner worlds, some sinful, some holy, most both. Not saints, not sinners, just people. When we read the manuals and the penitentials and the testimonies, a pattern emerges. Medieval people weren't sexually pure. They were sexually complex. They wanted love, or pleasure, or relief. They wanted to feel something other than fear, or cold, or routine. And they tried. They failed. They confessed. They dreamed. And sometimes they acted. We can't know how many fantasized and never spoke, or how many suffered and never found the right words. But we know they felt deeply, and that makes them more like us than we might expect. Sex in the medieval world wasn't just about desire. It was about power, shame, control, and nowhere did all of that collide more intensely than in the act of confession. When someone stepped into that dark wooden box, they weren't just telling secrets. They were putting themselves at the mercy of another human being, one who could forgive them or destroy them. This wasn't anonymous. Confession back then was personal. It was face to face. And sometimes it became dangerously intimate. Let's walk through a few real cases that show how tangled, human, and tragic this all could get. The girl, the confession, and the priest who wanted more. In 14th century France, a young woman named Aveline confessed to her parish priest that she'd had sexual thoughts about a man in her village. She'd done nothing, but the thoughts haunted her. The priest nodded solemnly, listened, told her to kneel. Then he asked for details. What did she think about? What did he look like? Had she touched herself while imagining it? This wasn't set uncommon. Some priests, especially the less pious ones, used confession to extract erotic stories from young women under the veil of spiritual care. It was a subtle kind of abuse, and it was difficult to prove. In Aveline's case, the priest soon began visiting her home under the pretense of spiritual support. Eventually, he offered her a deal: sleep with him, and her sins would be erased. She fled to another town, told a local abbot. The priest was quietly reassigned. No charges, no apology, just another stain on the church sept's record. The flagellant who couldn't stop. In 13th century Italy, a man named Matteo joined a lay brotherhood devoted to self-punishment. Every Friday, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves bloody in a public square. It was meant to purge sin, but Matteo grew addicted to it. He began doing it daily, then multiple times a day, then privately, in his room, sometimes moaning in what others described as a mix of pain and strange delight. He confessed to feeling unclean joy during penance. His priest told him to stop, but he could instead. Eventually, he was excommunicated, not for whipping, but for finding pleasure in repentance. The message was clear: suffering for God was holy. Enjoying that suffering made it perverse. That distinction haunted many devout believers for life. Sir Alaric of Bath was a respected noble, a landowner, a father of 5, and according to records from his private confessor, a man plagued by compulsive sexual sin. The nobleman set's dirty secret: he confessed monthly, sometimes weekly. He couldn't stop. But what's interesting isn't just his behavior, it's how he described it. Masturbation, lustful dreams, affairs with servants, ashamed, disgusted, weeping, begging for penance. At one point, he asked his confessor to publicly humiliate him in front of his own household. The priest refused. He was in set defiant. He was desperate. He stood shirtless before his staff, confessed his sins aloud, and flogged himself until he collapsed. So Alaric did it himself. It was instead performative. It was instead dramatic, and his story shows something essential. It was the only way he knew to fight what he saw as a demon inside him. Some people weren't set oppressed by the church. They were devoured by their own shame. The woman who lied and why it mattered. Not all confessions were honest. Some were calculated. In the 15th century, a woman named Isolde in York confessed to fornication, but not with the man she actually slept with. Instead, she named a wealthy merchant who had recently insulted her in public. Later, Isolde admitted the truth in a private letter, never meant to be seen. It was revenge, not repentance. The confession triggered a church investigation. The man was fined, forced to fast, and nearly excommunicated. His reputation never recovered. And this moment forces us to rethink what confession really was. It was instead always spiritual. It could be political. It could be personal. The secret manuals of confessors. Just like today, power could corrupt even the holiest rituals. It could be a weapon. By the 14th century, there were hundreds of confessors' guides in circulation, manuals for priests detailing every possible sin and how to address it. These weren't short pamphlets. Some were enormous, filled with charts, tables, and lists of filthy acts you'd never imagine showing up in church. They included masturbation alone, with animals, with objects, adultery with specifics on which positions were most sinful, homosexual acts with gradations of penance based on age, role, intent, bestiality, clerical sins because many priests were guilty too. The detail was staggering. This was the underside of medieval morality, a labyrinth of obsession disguised as guidance. One manual warned that a man who ejaculated into a well must fast for 20 days. Another listed which herbs a woman might use to hide signs of recent intercourse. Here's the hardest part. When forgiveness was conditional, the very system meant to purify the soul had turned into a catalog of the flesh. For a poor woman, confession might mean a humiliating public flogging. For a nobleman, it could be a private prayer and a generous donation. The same sin, different penance. Forgiveness was anestat free. The disparity created resentment. Quietly, people began to notice the hypocrisy. Some walked away from the church entirely. Others turned to folk healers, herbalists, or local wise women for spiritual support. Because deep down, many people sensed the truth. Confession had become less about healing and more about control. Why this still matters? You might wonder why dwell on this. Because when you peel back the layers of medieval confession, you don't just find sin, people afraid. You find humanity, people ashamed, people searching for peace in a system that didn't always offer it. They confessed because they hoped, because they wanted to be clean, because they believed, even through their fear, that someone, God, a priest, a ritual could wash away what they carried inside. That longing hasn't gone anywhere. We just call it therapy now, or journaling, or self-improvement. But it sets the same instinct, the hunger to speak our worst out loud and be told you'd still good. That's what medieval confession was supposed to be. Sometimes it was. Too often, it wasn't set. Medieval marriage was instead about love. Let's start with a blunt truth. It was about land, bloodlines, alliances, money. The wedding night, that was the transaction, the physical sealing of a contract. Sex wasn't a private act between two people who cared about each other. It was a public duty. Literally. In noble circles, families and witnesses would wait just outside the room, or in some cases, be present in the room until the sheets were bloodied, the act confirmed, and the contract fulfilled. Yes, seriously. Let's walk through what that looked like and what came after. The bedding ceremony, half ritual, half invasion. Imagine this. You're newly married. You've barely spoken to your spouse. Maybe you met them yesterday. You're both dragged into a chamber, undressed by relatives or servants, and then tucked into bed together while everyone watches or waits just outside the door. It was called the bedding ceremony. In some cases, the couple had to kiss in bed while a priest blessed them. In others, guests wouldn't leave until they were sure penetration had occurred. This wasn't set perversion. It was legal protection. A marriage was instead valid without consummation. If a couple didn't have sex, the union could be annulled. So families wanted evidence, witnesses, and in some extreme cases, the bloodied sheets were kept as proof. For nobles and royals, this was deadly serious. A childless marriage could start a war. The morning after, once consummation happened, the couple's sexual life didn't get easier. It got regulated. According to church teachings, married sex was only allowed for procreation in certain positions, missionary only, on specific days, not Sundays, not feast days, not Lent, etc. Without excessive pleasure, this meant that technically, a couple couldn't have sex for more than half the year. Did people follow these rules? Not really, but they lived with the guilt or tried to hide their pleasure under the guise of duty. Women especially were expected to be passive. Lust in a wife was seen as suspicious. If she enjoyed sex too much, she could be accused of witchcraft, adultery, or even demonic possession. The perfect wife was obedient, fertile, and quiet. When the marriage was a disaster, let's talk annulments. If a marriage wasn't consummated, if, say, the husband was impotent or the wife refused, the church could annul it. That meant the marriage was erased, like it never happened. And proving impotence? That was, in some cases, the man had to appear before clergy and publicly masturbate to show he could produce semen. If he couldn't, the marriage was dissolved. One nobleman reportedly had to perform in front of an ecclesiastical panel twice while a physician examined his vigor. When he failed, his wife's family annulled the marriage and married her off to someone else within weeks. Women, on the other hand, had it tougher. If a woman wanted an annulment, she often had to prove that her husband was impotent, that she remained a virgin, or that she'd been coerced into marriage. In one notorious case, a woman had to submit to medical inspection to prove her hymen was intact. Marriage was a contract. Sex was proof. No sex, no marriage. But if the man was powerful, even a failed consummation might be swept under the rug. Love matches? Rare, but real. Not every medieval marriage was cold and contractual. In towns and rural communities, especially among the lower classes, people often married for affection. They might have grown up together, worked together, laughed together. These couples still had to navigate church rules, but their sex lives were often more human, more private, more playful. Letters between peasant couples and merchant class spouses sometimes show genuine affection, jokes, pet names, even jealousy. One woman wrote to her traveling husband, "I miss your hands on me at night. My bed is cold. Return quickly, or I will warm it with another." Another man wrote to his wife, "I think of you in the hayfield, with your hair undone, your skirt lifted. Forgive me. I cannot sleep for the memory." Those moments, small, intimate, and real, cut through the theology and law. When husbands took lovers and wives had to smile. Here sits the brutal reality. A married nobleman could take a mistress, and as long as he didn't bring scandal or illegitimate heirs into the household, the church usually looked the other way. Mistresses weren't always hidden. In some cases, they were installed in the household, given rooms, clothing, even servants. Wives were expected to endure. In one royal court, a queen reportedly had to dine at the same table as her husband's mistress every night, while courtiers pretended nothing was wrong. The wife couldn't leave. Divorce was nearly impossible, and public complaint would bring shame, not to the husband, but to her. This led to a culture of silence, a theater of obedience. Wives smiled while their husbands betrayed them, all under the gaze of the church. When wives had lovers too, but women weren't saints. They weren't always submissive, and they definitely weren't set always faithful. Some women, especially noble women with resources, took lovers of their own. It was risky, deadly even, but in certain circles it happened, and everyone knew it. There are court records of noble women who orchestrated secret affairs with squires, priests, even traveling merchants. Some got caught, others didn't. One duchess in Burgundy maintained a long-term relationship with her music tutor for over a decade. When her husband died, she quietly had the tutor promoted and married him in secret. The church frowned, the people whispered, but she no longer cared. The gendered double standard. Ultimately, medieval marriage was about hierarchy, and sex within marriage followed the same rules. Husband, active, dominant, licensed. Wife, passive, receptive, controlled, A husband could rape his wife. It wasn't considered a crime. A wife could not refuse her husband's advances unless she was bleeding, pregnant, or sick. But the reverse was instead true. If a wife forced her husband, she could be charged with inversion of nature. It was instead about consent. It was about roles. Only later, much later, would people begin to question that power dynamic. In the end, a bedroom full of expectations. When we look at medieval marriage, we see a paradox. It was supposed to be holy, sacred, a reflection of divine union, but in practice, it was messy, political, often loveless, and always shaped by sex. Not desire, not intimacy, not pleasure, sex. As duty, as proof, as currency. Still, people were people. They found ways to love, to cheat, to resist, to hide, to dream. And sometimes they found something resembling happiness. In a world where a woman's value was tied to her womb, contraception was subversive, fertility was political, and pregnancy wasn't just personal, it was public currency. If a noble woman didn't produce an heir, she was at risk of being cast aside. If a peasant woman had too many mouths to feed, her family might starve. The stakes were life and death. So medieval women, despite the church's teachings, found ways to take control. Let's talk about how. First, let's be clear. Contraception wasn't invented in the 20th century. Medieval people didn't have IUDs or birth control pills, but they weren't clueless. They used herbs to prevent pregnancy, mechanical barriers, yes, really, magical charms and spoken spells, withdrawal and timing methods, and in desperate cases, abortifacients. The church condemned all of it, but that didn't stop people, especially women, from trying. Herbs, potions, and the apothecary sip's secret shelf. Let's start with the herbs. Many women knew which plants could affect fertility, and this knowledge was passed through generations, not in books, but in whispered conversations, folk rhymes, and kitchen rituals. Some of the most common included pennyroyal, used as both a contraceptive and abortifacient, taken as tea, oil, or even soaked in cloth, and inserted, effective, but toxic in high doses. Silphium, a plant so popular in Roman and early medieval birth control that it went extinct. By the time we hit high medieval Europe, it was already gone. Rue, tansy, and savin, used in tonics to purge the womb. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, taken after sex to prevent implantation. These weren't safe. Some were outright poisonous in the wrong dose, but for many women, the risk was worth it, especially for peasants who couldn't afford another child. Animal bladders, sea sponges, and the early condom. Believe it or not, there were rudimentary barrier methods too. Animal intestines and bladders were sometimes fashioned into early condoms, not for contraception initially, but to prevent disease. But in brothels and some noble households, women used wool soaked in vinegar or sea sponges, dipped in wine or oil, and inserted before sex. These makeshift diaphragms were rarely discussed publicly, but they show up in medieval medical texts, coded in euphemisms. Just a fan, and again, their use was criminalized by church law. Timing, withdrawal, and the rhythm of the moon. More subtle methods included coitus interruptus withdrawal, common, especially among the literate or urban populations. The theologians railed against it. Men used it anyway, lunar tracking, and fertility awareness. Some midwives and healers tracked menstrual cycles and advised couples on safer times for intercourse. Women in rural areas often had their own lunar calendars scratched into wood or bone, private tools to help them plan or avoid pregnancy. This was proto-science, early body literacy, and for some women it was the only power they had over their lives. When control failed, the desperate path of abortion. Let's not pretend this was common or easy, but it existed. Women who were desperate, unmarried, betrayed, raped, or simply exhausted sometimes turned to abortifacient herbs or ritual expulsions. Herbs like ergot, a toxic fungus on rye, black cohosh, mugwort. Midwives might also recommend violent motion, riding horses hard, lifting heavy loads, scalding baths, or deep abdominal massage to induce miscarriage. These were dangerous. Many women died. Others suffered permanent damage. But for some, it was the only option in a world where pregnancy could mean ruin or death. Infertility. A curse, a crime, or a divine test. Now imagine the opposite problem. No children, no matter how often you try. Infertility was terrifying, and the blame almost always fell on the woman, even though modern science tells us men are equally responsible. Women who failed to conceive could be destas, sent back to their fathers, replaced by another wife or mistress, accused of witchcraft, or dragged to church courts and forced to prove they weren't intentionally barren. Doctors prescribed absurd remedies: eating boiled hare womb, sleeping with a fertility idol under your bed, ingesting dried frog powder, drinking wine soaked with dried testicles of deer. And when that failed, some couples turned to pilgrimages, begging saints for help, the Virgin Mary, and the Holy Fertility Circuit. There were entire pilgrimage routes built around fertility. Women would travel miles to touch relics of Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, drink water from sacred springs, or pray at statues of the Virgin Mary, known for blessing barren women. Some even swallowed small stones from holy sites, believing they would open the womb. In one famous case, a noblewoman reportedly made a pilgrimage in chains, crawling on her knees to atone for sins that closed her womb. It worked. She conceived. Or so the records say. Midwives, healers, gatekeepers, and quiet revolutionaries. Let's talk about the real heroes of medieval female reproductive control. Midwives. They were the only medical professionals many women ever saw trusted for birth, contraception, and postpartum care, often feared by men and clergy for their knowledge. Midwives knew how to turn breech babies, repair torn perineums, and administer herbal medicine, but they also knew how to prevent conception or how to end it, and this made them dangerous. Some were accused of sorcery. Others were dragged before church courts. A few were even executed for using forbidden knowledge. But most walked a tightrope, serving their communities quietly, discreetly, and with incredible skill. They were instead radicals. They were survivors. The church sit's official view: women shouldn't sit, even want this power. According to church doctrine, contraception was a sin, an act of mistrust in God sits, and in many cases, a form of murder. Sex was for procreation, period. Any attempt to separate pleasure from reproduction was considered lustful, a mortal sin, and women who used contraception were often accused of being whores. being witches, or being unnatural. Some theologians even argued that a barren womb was God's punishment for female pride. But women kept resisting because they had to. What it really meant. In public, sex was regulated. In private, it was negotiated between fear and survival, desire and consequence. Women didn't have legal power over their bodies, but they carved out space, secret knowledge, quiet alliances, midwife wisdom, and ancient herbal traditions. These weren't always safe, but they were the only defense women had against being turned into baby-making machines. In a world where the bedroom was a battleground, the womb was both a weapon and a prison. And every choice a woman made, every herb, every chant, every whispered consultation, was an act of rebellion against a system built to control her. Let Seps flip the script. Not every woman in medieval Europe was locked into a life of endless childbearing, male authority, or sexual obligation. Some broke free through widowhood, religious devotion, clever maneuvering, or sheer force of will. This section is about them, the ones who lived outside the rules, the ones who redefined what it meant to be a woman in a society obsessed with sex, marriage, and reproduction. The widow feared, free, and financially dangerous. In the medieval hierarchy, a widow was both pitied and feared. She was no longer a virgin, no longer a wife, but often in control of land, money, or property. And unlike unmarried girls, she didn't answer to her father. Unlike wives, she didn't answer to a husband. That made her a problem, especially if she had no sons or male guardians. In some places, widows could own property outright, run businesses, sue in court, make wills, and even choose not to remarry. A bold widow with wealth and no sons could quietly become one of the most powerful women in town, and many did. Sexual independence. The widow's unspoken power. Here sits the other thing no one wanted to say aloud. Widows had sexual autonomy. There was no expectation of chastity anymore. Some chose lovers. Some chose chastity. Some quietly ran small brothels or inns with discreet upstairs rooms. And since they often wore black and lived discreetly, they could slip between worlds, respected in public, but with private lives that no one dared question. Of course, the church disapproved, but the reality was, many widows enjoyed more personal freedom than they ever had before. Chaste marriage, when sex was voluntarily taken off the table. Now imagine this. A man and woman marry and agree never to consummate the relationship. Sounds odd? It happened more often than you think, especially among the nobility and deeply religious. Chaste marriages were sometimes arranged for spiritual reasons. Couples might take vows of celibacy together, living more like siblings than spouses. Why would anyone do this? To prove spiritual purity, to avoid childbirth or family obligations, to dedicate their household to God, or in some cases, because one or both partners were secretly gay. This kind of marriage was rare, but respected in certain circles. The church loved it, and some saints like Saint Cecilia or Saint Elizabeth of Hungary were celebrated for their chaste unions. It was a quiet way to dodge the sexual expectations of the time without abandoning respectability. Anchorites, abbesses, and the nuns who escaped it all let Seps go even further. What if you never married at all? For some women, especially daughters of the nobility, the answer was the church. Becoming a nun, abbess, or even an anchorite offered a life completely outside the expectations of marriage and motherhood. Yes, it was strict. Yes, it meant obedience, but it also meant no husbands, no pregnancies, no sexual obligations. Some women genuinely felt called to religious life. Others were pushed into it by families who couldn't afford dowries. But once inside, women could rise through the ranks. A powerful abbess could rule over dozens of nuns, manage land, oversee income, and influence local politics. And the best part, they answered only to the Pope, not local bishops or male lords, anchorites. The strange lives of the living dead. The most extreme escape was becoming an anchorite, a woman or man who voluntarily sealed themselves into a small cell attached to a church, devoting their lives to prayer. It was a living burial. Once inside, anchorites never left. They were fed through a small window. They often had only one slit for light and a second one to hear Mass. Some did this out of deep faith, others as penance. But, for a few, it was an escape from a violent husband or family. It was radical and revered. People sought anchorites out for advice. Bishops consulted them. Towns saw them as living saints. Imagine that. Complete celibacy, silence, and solitude as liberation, lesbianism, sisterhoods, and the hidden networks of women. Now let's talk about what didn't get written down. Most medieval records were written by men, which means women's relationships with each other, especially romantic or sexual ones, were usually ignored or suppressed. But they existed. In convents and across female households, women formed deep, emotionally intense bonds. Some were platonic, some were romantic, some were sexual. The term lesbian didn't exist in medieval Europe, but female same-sex relationships did, hidden in the margins. In rare cases, we have court records of women being tried for unnatural acts. In others, poems or letters suggest deeper bonds. But for the most part, these relationships existed in private, away from male scrutiny. In convents, they were often the safest places for these attachments to form, places where women could explore identity, love, and companionship on their own terms, a sexuality, choice, and the women who just opted out. Not every woman had a burning need for sex. And in a society that pushed every woman toward marriage, pregnancy, and sexual availability, choosing none of the above was a radical act. There were women who simply refused marriage proposals, remained celibate by choice, dedicated themselves to education, medicine, or craft, or simply lived quiet, unmarried lives at the edge of town. These women were sometimes seen as witches, spinsters, or weirdos, but some earned respect as healers, teachers, or solitary mystics. In choosing not to be defined by sex, they defied everything medieval society expected from a woman. The double standard remained, but so did resistance. Here sips the bottom line. Medieval Europe was built on control of sex, of reproduction, of women's bodies. But not every woman fit the mold. Whether by widowhood, religion, defiance, or quiet self-preservation, many women carved out lives that sidestepped the roles handed to them. They weren't set revolutionaries. They didn't set riot in the streets, but they did something braver. They lived their lives by different rules, even when no one wrote them down. And they remind us that even in the most rigid societies, resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like silence or a locked door. or a life lived quietly, far from the expectations of men. Let's set the stage. You're walking through a medieval city after sundown. It smells like wood smoke, rotting food, and piss. There are no streetlights, just the flicker of torches, and somewhere between the town square and the cathedral, you hear a muffled scuffle. Two lovers or a thief? Could be either, because in many cities, sex and crime blurred together. This section is about how cities tried, and mostly failed, to control sex in public and private. From night watchmen to whipping posts, from indecency laws to prostitute taxes, medieval urban life was anything but prudish. It was messy, chaotic, loud, and surprisingly well documented. Let's walk through it. Urban vice. Why sex was an open secret in every city. Every major town, London, Paris, Florence, Prague, had its own flavor of debauchery. There were streetwalkers and tavern girls, traveling troubadours with suggestive songs, and bathhouses where things got far steamier than a simple soak. City councils knew this. Bishops knew it. Night watchmen definitely knew it. And yet, the system rarely cracked down hard. Why? Because vice brought in money, fines for public indecency, taxes on brothels, licensing fees for sex workers, bribes paid by madams and innkeepers. Cities ran on this income, just as much as they ran on grain and taxes. So instead of eradicating sex, they tried to manage it, control it, push it out of sight, fine it when it got too loud, whipping posts, and shame parades. Here's how punishment often worked. If you were caught having sex in public or with the wrong person, you might end up tied to the whipping post, lashed with birch rods, then paraded through town. Some cities even had mobile stocks for immoral behavior. Couples caught fornicating were sometimes forced to wear signs saying adulterer or whore, made to walk barefoot through the market square, doused in sewage or garbage as punishment. It wasn't about justice. It was about public spectacle, a reminder to everyone else that sex had its limits. But it didn't stop people. It's made them more discreet. The role of the night watchman. The night watch was an after stop theft. Their other job? Keep an eye and ear out for unlicensed brothels, lovers sneaking into each other's seps' homes, clergy consorting with prostitutes, and same-sex couples in public places. If they caught you, they could detain you for the church courts, demand bribes to look the other way, or rough you up, then report the incident to the magistrate. In some cities, night patrols were more interested in collecting fines than enforcing morality. They'd take a cut, report you anyway, and leave the paperwork to someone else. The line between law enforcement and extortion was thin. Sex laws were local and wildly inconsistent. There was no universal code for sexual behavior. In some towns, adultery was punishable by death. In others, it cost you a fine and a public apology. In a few places, clergy were exempt from punishment if they paid a fee. Cities like Florence had detailed ordinances about who could run a brothel, how far it had to be from a church, what hours it could operate, and even what colors prostitutes could wear. In Paris, sex workers were forbidden from wearing fur or gold. In London, they could only operate in certain parishes, and only if they paid a licensing fee to the city. You could live a block apart in two different cities and face radically different consequences for the same act. Moral panic and the periodic purges. Occasionally, things boiled over. There'd be a moral panic a sermon that struck a nerve, a disease outbreak, or a scandal involving a nobleman, and suddenly the city would go on a purge. Brothels were burned down, sex workers were jailed or expelled, public indecency laws were tightened, judges handed down harsher sentences, but it never lasted. Within months, the brothels were back, sometimes in the exact same spot. The fines resumed, the bribes resumed, and life went on. The tension between control and desire was built into the system. Medieval cities weren't clean, orderly places. They were messy, breathing organisms, and sex was in their bloodstream. Let sets talk about brothels, not as dens of shame or hidden filth, but as official businesses, licensed and taxed by the same city officials who condemned sin on Sundays. This is one of the strangest contradictions of medieval life. The same institutions that claimed to defend morality were also profiting off immorality. The church knew and cashed in. Here's the twist. While the church officially preached celibacy and chastity, it also owned property that housed brothels. Yes, monasteries and bishoprics sometimes rented land or buildings to brothel owners and collected regular rent. In some towns, priests would bless the building before it opened, just to cleanse it. In others, the church turned a blind eye, so long as the brothel didn't operate during Mass. It sounds hypocritical, but from their point of view, it was practical. Better to contain sin, tax it, and regulate it, than pretend it could be abolished. The regulated brothel system. In places like London, Paris, Avignon, and Cologne, brothels weren't illegal. They were semi-official. Here's how it usually worked. The city designated certain streets or districts as red light zones. Brothel owners had to register with the city or bishop. They paid monthly or quarterly taxes. Sex workers had to follow rules where they could work, what they could wear, when they could solicit. The brothel had to close during religious festivals, and Lent. In return, they received a form of legal protection, at least in theory. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. Some cities let brothels operate with minimal interference. Others shut them down and reopened them repeatedly, depending on who was in charge. Who worked in these brothels? The sex workers weren't set always, who you said expect. Yes, many were poor women with no other options, but others were widows looking to support themselves, girls sold into service by desperate families, foreign women who couldn't marry due to class or language, in some cases runaway nuns. Yes, that happened more than you'd think. A few even chose the work willingly, preferring their earnings and freedom over domestic labor or marriage. They weren't powerless. Some brothel workers formed networks to protect each other, bribe officials, or share customers. The madams, meanwhile, could become wealthy and influential, running large houses with staff, guards, and city contacts. Taxes, fines, and bribes. The economic engine of sin. City ledgers from the 13th to 15th centuries show detailed records of sex-related income, fines for unlawful coupling, fees paid by women of the night, the rents from houses of disrepute, licensing coin from Madame Olette. In some years, income from brothel taxes and sex fines made up 5 to 10% of a city's total revenue. That's massive. And it wasn't just the brothels. Sex-related offenses, adultery, fornication, sodomy, were all finable. People paid to stay out of jail, paid to avoid public shaming, paid to keep their names out of church records. It was a business model, not a moral crusade. Scandals in the church and clerical hypocrisy. Of course, the church liked to pretend it was above all this, but it was instead. From bishops caught frequenting brothels to monks running secret houses of hospitality, the line between preacher and client was thin. Some monasteries even paid hush money to brothel owners to avoid public scandal. And in places like Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, there were entire red light districts frequented by clerics. Contemporary records show priests involved in paying for underage sex, running side brothels for income, illegally harboring concubines. When caught, they were rarely punished harshly. Instead, the church often transferred them to another town or gave them a fine. Sound familiar? Even back then, institutions protected their own. Public attitudes, hypocrisy, and acceptance. The average person knew all of this. They knew the city taxed vice while preaching virtue. They knew the priests were set celibate. They knew sex workers were exploited and criminalized, yet also tolerated. And for the most part, people shrugged. Sex was part of life, messy, complicated, inevitable. They didn't have the modern urge to moralize everything. Instead, they focused on balance, keeping sex out of sight when necessary, punishing it when it embarrassed the town, and tolerating it the rest of the time. It was a strange, bureaucratic kind of tolerance. No one was happy, but no one really expected perfection either. Let Seps talk about enforcement. It's one thing to write a law. It's another thing entirely to enforce it, especially when the subject is sex. In medieval cities, there were dozens of laws about who could have sex, with whom, where, when, how, and under what conditions. But the truth? The system was riddled with loopholes, exceptions, and selective enforcement. And power, real power, rested in the hands of the people who controlled the information, not the people who wrote the laws. The sexual surveillance machine. Let's set the scene. Picture a medieval town at night. Narrow streets, wooden buildings, flickering torchlight, and moving through it all, a small band of night watchmen. Not soldiers, not police, but more like neighborhood tattletales with authority. Their job was to keep the peace, catch criminals, and more importantly, they'd peer through cracks, watch who entered which door, and report unusual activity, especially if it looked like someone was sneaking around with someone they shouldn't. If a married woman was spotted with a young squire, if a priest was seen entering a bathhouse after dark, they'd take notes, then pass it to the local magistrate or bishop's court records and confessions. We have thousands of surviving court records detailing sex-related cases. Here's Sips what shows up most. Adultery, especially if one partner was married and the other wasn't set. Fornication, sex between unmarried people. Sodomy, a vague category used to target same-sex acts, but also anything non-reproductive. Incest, often broadly defined, even including distant cousins. Public indecency, couples caught in fields, barns, or alleyways. Mistress-keeping men who housed lovers outside of marriage. Now here's the kicker. Most of these crimes came to court not through investigations, but through gossip. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Rivals denounced each other. Sometimes jealous exes sought revenge by reporting liaisons. The courts didn't need proof. They just needed a confession, or failing that, 3 witnesses, penalties. humiliation over incarceration. So, what happened if you got caught? Jail wasn't common, prisons were expensive and dangerous. Instead, punishment focused on public shame, parading through town wearing nothing but a shirt, standing tied to a whipping post, walking barefoot to the church to confess publicly, wearing a sign announcing your sin. Sometimes there were fines. If you had money, you could pay your way out of trouble. But if you were poor, you suffered. And if you were female, you almost always suffered more. Who got punished and who got away? Let's be real. These laws weren't about justice. They were about control. And who got punished usually came down to power, money, and status. A noble caught with a maid? Probably nothing. A priest with a mistress? He might get reassigned. A merchant's wife caught cheating? Public shaming. A poor girl accused of fornication? Whipping and exile. Sex laws were weapons. You could use them to hurt enemies, silence rivals, or disgrace a family. They weren't about morality. They were about hierarchy, loopholes, and technicalities. Some people knew how to work the system. If a woman became pregnant out of wedlock, but married before the birth, she could escape punishment. If you claimed the sex happened during a betrothal, the church might accept it. Clerics could invoke benefit of clergy to escape secular penalties. Nobles could demand to be judged only by peers. There were even ways to bribe scribes to alter court records or lose them entirely. In other words, the law was bendable. For the right price, for the right people, secret relationships, and silent networks. Despite all this surveillance and control, people still found ways to connect. Lovers met in churchyards at dusk, using candle codes or arranged confessions to pass messages. Women hosted secret gatherings where sex workers, midwives, and servants shared tips, warnings, and secrets. In big cities like Paris or Florence, whole underground economies formed: discreet inns, message runners, bathhouse couriers, even coded love songs passed through musicians. People had affairs, flings, romances, trysts, and sometimes lifelong partnerships that defied official norms. It was risky, but they did it anyway because they were human. Final thought: who really controlled sex in medieval cities? Not the kings, not the priests, not the laws written in Latin. Control lived in the hands of the watchers, the whisperers, and the ones who knew how to listen. The maid who saw which knight entered the back door, the scribe who copied confessions, the townswoman who knew every scandal but said nothing unless it served her. Sex was power, and that power flowed through hidden networks, whispered alliances, and silent leverage. That's what made the whole system both terrifying and fascinating.